The religious landscape of prehistoric Europe emerges from archaeological shadows through scattered bone fragments, carefully arranged stone circles, and burial chambers that speak to sophisticated spiritual concepts predating written history by millennia. These earliest manifestations of European paganism reveal themselves not through grand temples or elaborate texts, but through the deliberate placement of grave goods, the orientation of burial sites towards celestial phenomena, and the monumental effort invested in creating sacred spaces that would endure for thousands of years. Archaeological excavations across the European continent have uncovered evidence of religious practices stretching back to the Neolithic period, beginning around 7000 BC. At Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, though geographically at Europe's edge, researchers discovered wall paintings depicting human figures surrounded by enormous vultures, suggesting early concepts of death transformation and spiritual journey. More directly relevant to European development, sites like Lepenski Vir along the Danube River in modern Serbia reveal sophisticated burial practices from around 6000 BC, where human remains were interred alongside carved stone sculptures depicting fish-like beings, indicating beliefs in supernatural entities governing natural forces. The megalithic tomb builders of Atlantic Europe left perhaps the most striking evidence of early religious consciousness. At Newgrange in Ireland, constructed around 3200 BC, the passage tomb's entrance was precisely aligned to capture the winter solstice sunrise, flooding the inner chamber with light for exactly 17 minutes each year. This astronomical precision required generations of observation and mathematical calculation, demonstrating that Neolithic Europeans possessed sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles and incorporated this knowledge into their sacred architecture. Similar alignments appear at Machau in Orkney, where the midwinter sunset illuminates the tomb's interior, and at countless other megalithic sites across Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe. Burial customs from this period reveal increasingly complex spiritual beliefs. At the West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire, excavations uncovered evidence of selective bone removal and rearrangement, suggesting ancestor veneration practices where specific body parts held particular significance. The careful sorting of skulls, long bones, and smaller fragments indicates beliefs about different aspects of human essence, requiring distinct treatment in death. Grave goods accompanying burials evolved from simple tools and food offerings to elaborate assemblages including polished stone axes, amber beads, and copper ornaments, implying concepts of afterlife existence requiring material provisions. The transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age Europe around 2500 BC coincided with dramatic cultural shifts that would fundamentally reshape European religious traditions. The emergence of the corded ware culture across northern and central Europe introduced new burial practices, including individual interments in wooden coffins beneath earthen mounds, replacing earlier collective tomb burials. These changes reflected evolving concepts of individual identity and personal spiritual journey, laying groundwork for later Indo-European religious emphasis on heroic individual achievement and divine favour. Proto-Indo-European mythology, reconstructed through comparative analysis of later Indo-European religious traditions, provides insight into the spiritual framework that would dominate European paganism for millennia. The proto-language itself contains numerous terms for supernatural concepts that appear consistently across diverse Indo-European cultures, suggesting common ancestral beliefs. The reconstructed root diez, meaning bright sky, evolved into Zeus among Greeks, Jupiter among Romans, and Tyr among Germanic peoples, indicating shared veneration of a celestial father deity associated with daylight justice and cosmic order. Complementing the Sky Father, Proto-Indo-European religion included Earth Mother concepts reflected in reconstructed terms like Gathon, relating to earth and ground. This divine feminine principle governed fertility agriculture, and the cyclical death and rebirth observable in seasonal changes. The tension and cooperation between celestial masculine and terrestrial feminine forces formed a fundamental dualism that permeated later European pagan traditions, manifesting in countless divine couples like the Germanic Woden and Frigg, Celtic Dagda and Brigid, or Slavic Perun and Mokosh. The Proto-Indo-European pantheon extended beyond these primary deities to include specialized divine functions. Reconstructed mythology suggests veneration of a thunder god, evidenced by cognate terms appearing in Germanic Thor, Celtic Taranis, Baltic Perkunus, and Slavic Perun. This deity wielded supernatural weapons, typically hammers or axes, to battle chaotic forces threatening cosmic order. Archaeological evidence from Bronze Age Europe supports these reconstructions through frequent discoveries of miniature hammer pendants and axe-shaped votives in ritual contexts. Fire held particular significance in Proto-Indo-European religion, reflected in the goddess Hungunis, whose name connects to Latin ignis and Sanskrit agni, both meaning fire. This divine fire was simultaneously destructive and purifying, consuming offerings to transmit them to supernatural realms while cleansing pollution and evil influences. Sacred hearths maintained by specialized priestesses appear in later Indo-European cultures from Ireland to India, suggesting ancient continuity of fire worship practices. The Yamnaya culture, emerging around 3300 BC in the Pontic-Caspian steppes, played a crucial role in spreading Indo-European religious concepts across Europe through massive migration waves beginning around 3000 BC. These semi-nomadic pastoralists possessed advanced bronze working technology, wheeled vehicles, and domesticated horses, providing significant advantages in both warfare and long-distance travel. Their distinctive burial practices included individual interments in pit graves beneath Kurgan mounds, often accompanied by wheeled carts, weapons, and animal sacrifices. Yamnaya religious practices reflected their pastoral lifestyle and mobile culture. Unlike earlier European farmers who built permanent stone monuments, the Yamnaya created portable sacred objects including anthropomorphic stelae depicting armed warriors or deities. These stone figures, discovered across the steppe region, typically display belted tunics, weapons, and sometimes celestial symbols, suggesting veneration of warrior deities associated with sky phenomena. The mobility of these religious symbols facilitated their spread across vast distances as Yamnaya groups migrated westward into Europe. Genetic and archaeological evidence demonstrates that Yamnaya migrations profoundly impacted European populations between 3000 and 2500 BC. In Britain, Yamnaya-related ancestry appears suddenly around 2500 BC, coinciding with the appearance of beaker culture burial practices and the construction of Stonehenge's iconic Trulithon Circle. Similar patterns emerge across continental Europe, where Yamnaya genetic signatures correlate with the spread of corded ware and bell beaker cultures, both associated with distinctive religious practices including individual burial, metalwork offerings, and astronomical monument construction. The religious synthesis resulting from Yamnaya, contact with existing European populations, created hybrid traditions combining Indo-European sky worship with indigenous earth veneration. At Stonehenge, the monument's final phase incorporated both solar alignments characteristic of earlier Neolithic builders and the circular stone arrangements reminiscent of steppe traditions. The famous heel stone, marking the midsummer sunrise, demonstrates continuity with earlier astronomical practices, while the massive trilithons required organizational capabilities and religious motivation, reflecting new cultural priorities. Carnac in Brittany exemplifies the complexity of religious development during this transitional period. The site's megalithic alignments, consisting of over 3,000 standing stones arranged in parallel rows stretching for kilometres, were erected between 4,500 and 3,300 BC. predating major Indo-European migrations. However, later additions and modifications to the site suggest continued religious significance for subsequent populations. The stone's astronomical alignments track lunar cycles and seasonal changes, indicating sophisticated mathematical knowledge integrated with spiritual beliefs about cosmic harmony and divine order. Bronze Age religious practices across Europe reveal increasing standardization of ritual forms, suggesting widespread cultural exchange facilitated by improved transportation and communication networks. Votive deposits in rivers, lakes and bogs become common across the continent, with similar assemblages of weapons, jewellery and tools appearing from Ireland to Romania. These offerings typically consist of high-value items deliberately damaged or killed before deposition, implying beliefs about transforming material objects into spiritual currency acceptable to supernatural beings. The Nebrasky disc, discovered in Germany and dating to approximately 1600 BC, represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of Bronze Age European astronomical religious art. This bronze disc, decorated with gold symbols representing the sun, moon, stars and celestial boat, demonstrates advanced understanding of lunar cycles and seasonal astronomical phenomena. The disc's multiple modification phases suggest evolving religious concepts over several generations, with later additions including a golden arc marking the annual solar path and symbols possibly representing the Pleiades constellation. Scandinavian rock art from the Bronze Age provides extensive evidence of religious beliefs and practices across northern Europe. Sites like Tanum in Sweden contain thousands of petroglyphs depicting ships, warriors, animals, and supernatural beings engaged in ritual activities. These images frequently show human figures in apparent worship poses before larger supernatural entities, suggesting established priesthood and formal religious ceremonies. The prominence of ship imagery in landlocked regions indicates symbolic rather than literal meaning, possibly representing souls' journey to otherworld realms or divine vessels carrying celestial deities. The religious landscape of Bronze Age Europe also reveals increasing social stratification reflected in burial practices and monument construction. Elite graves contain elaborate assemblages of imported goods, including amber from the Baltic, gold from Transylvania, and bronze from Alpine regions, indicating extensive trade networks that facilitated cultural and religious exchange. These wealthy burials often include symbols of religious authority, such as ceremonial axes, gold diadems, and ritual vessels, suggesting that political and spiritual power became increasingly concentrated in hereditary elites. Sacred groves and natural springs gained prominence as religious centres during this period, complementing the earlier emphasis on constructed monuments. Bog bodies from across northern Europe, many showing evidence of ritual killing, demonstrate beliefs about sacrifice to supernatural forces governing natural phenomena. The Tolland man, preserved in a Danish peat bog and dating to approximately 400 BC, was found with a leather cord around his neck and traces of grain porridge in his stomach, suggesting ritual preparation before sacrificial death. Similar discoveries across Britain, Ireland, Germany and Scandinavia indicate widespread practices of human sacrifice to ensure agricultural fertility or divine favour. The development of metallurgy introduced new dimensions to European religious practice through the creation of specialised ritual objects impossible to produce in earlier stoneworking traditions. Bronze horns, or lures, discovered across Scandinavia were clearly designed for ceremonial rather than practical purposes, with their elaborate spiral forms and rich acoustic properties suited for religious music. Similarly, the Trundholm Sun chariot from Denmark, featuring a bronze horse pulling a golden solar disk, represents sophisticated religious symbolism combining multiple divine elements in a single artistic creation. The Celtic religious traditions that emerged across Iron Age Europe represented one of the most sophisticated and influential spiritual systems of the ancient world. developing distinct characteristics while maintaining deep connections to earlier Indo-European foundations. Archaeological evidence from Hallstatt culture sites dating to 800 BC reveals the earliest recognisable Celtic religious practices, characterised by elaborate votive offerings deposited in lakes and rivers, monumental earthwork sanctuaries, and burial customs that emphasise both individual heroic achievement and collective tribal identity. The Latin culture, flourishing from approximately 450 BC onward, witnessed the full flowering of Celtic spirituality, with its intricate artistic expressions serving as both religious symbols and markers of sacred authority. Celtic deities formed a complex pantheon that varied significantly across different tribal territories, while maintaining recognisable core characteristics and functions. Lugh, whose name derives from the Proto-Celtic root meaning light or brightness, emerged as perhaps the most widely venerated deity across Celtic lands, with his worship extending from Ireland to Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula. Archaeological evidence of Lugh's prominence appears in numerous place names, including Lugdunum, Luguvalium and Luguvalium in Britain. Irish mythology portrays Lugh as a master of all skills, particularly associated with craftsmanship, warfare and kingship, while Gaulish inscriptions identify him as Lugus, often depicted with ravens and associated with oaths and contracts. Brigid represented the quintessential Celtic goddess of smithcraft, poetry and healing, embodying the transformative powers of fire and water. Her cult centres, identified through archaeological excavations, typically featured sacred wells or springs alongside evidence of metalworking activities. At Kildare in Ireland, the sacred fire maintained by her priestesses burned continuously for centuries, while similar perpetual flames associated with Brigid's worship have been documented at sites across Britain and Gaul. The goddess's triple aspect, reflected in medieval Irish literature as Brigid the Smith, Brigid the Poet and Brigid the Healer, demonstrates the Celtic tendency to conceptualize divine power through multiple interconnected functions rather than singular attributes. Cernunnos, the antlered god whose image appears on the famous Gundestrup cauldron discovered in a Danish bog, embodied the wild, untamed aspects of nature and the cycles of death and regeneration. Archaeological representations show him seated in a cross-legged position, surrounded by animals and holding or displaying torques, ram-headed serpents and bags of grain. The Pillar of the Boatman, erected by Gaulish sailors in Paris during the 1st century AD, depicts Cernunnos alongside Roman deities, indicating his continued importance even under imperial rule. His association with stags, whose antlers shed and regrow annually, symbolise the eternal cycle of seasonal death and rebirth that govern both natural and human existence. The Morrigan, whose name translates as Phantom Queen or Great Queen, represented the most complex and fearsome aspect of Celtic divine feminine power. Irish literature describes her as a triple goddess capable of shapeshifting between human and animal forms, particularly crows and ravens. Archaeological evidence of her worship appears in the form of crow and raven bones deposited in ritual contexts, along with weapons and armour offerings found in rivers and lakes. The Morrigan's role extended beyond mere war goddess to encompass prophecy, sovereignty, and the fate of kings and kingdoms. Her appearances in mythological narratives typically occur at crucial moments of political transition, where her favour or displeasure determines the outcome of dynastic struggles. Regional variations in Celtic religious practice reflected the diverse tribal structures and environmental conditions across Celtic Europe. In Gaul, Mercury held particular prominence, identified by Roman sources as the most widely worshipped deity, though this likely represents a conflation of multiple Celtic gods sharing mercantile and communicative functions. The Gaulish god Teutates, whose name means god of the tribe, received offerings of human sacrifice according to Roman accounts, with victims drowned in sacred pools or cauldrons. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ribemont-sur-Ancre in northern France reveals large-scale ritual deposits of human and animal bones, weapons, and personal ornaments, supporting literary accounts of massive communal sacrifices following military victories. British Celtic traditions develop distinctive characteristics influenced by the island's geographical isolation and unique cultural synthesis. The god Nodens, worshipped at the elaborate temple complex of Lydney in Gloucestershire, combined healing functions with associations to dogs, the hunt, and the sea. The site's archaeological remains include a guest house for pilgrims, healing pools, and numerous votive offerings depicting body parts requiring divine intervention. Similarly, the goddess Sulis, venerated at Bath, presided over the natural hot springs that attracted visitors from across Roman Britain. Curse tablets deposited in her sacred pool reveal the goddess's role in dispensing justice and revenge, with petitioners requesting divine punishment for thieves, unfaithful lovers, and business rivals. Druidic practices formed the institutional backbone of Celtic religious life, with these priest-scholars serving multiple functions as religious officiants, legal arbitrators, medical practitioners, and keepers of oral tradition. Caesar's ethnographic accounts, while filtered through Roman perspectives, provide valuable insights into Druidic organisation and training. Prospective Druids underwent 20 years of education, memorising vast quantities of poetry, law, genealogy and religious lore without recourse to written texts. This oral tradition preserved not only religious knowledge, but also tribal histories, legal precedents, and technical information about astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. Archaeological evidence of Druidic activities appears primarily through the identification of sacred groves and ritual deposits, rather than permanent temple structures. The sanctuary at Gournay-sur-Ahonde in northern France reveals a rectangular enclosure containing a central pit where weapons, animal bones and human remains were deposited over several centuries. The careful arrangement of these offerings, with weapons ritually bent or broken before deposition, indicates sophisticated ceremonial protocols governing the interaction between human and divine realms. Similar sites across Celtic Europe demonstrate standardized ritual practices that suggest coordinated religious instruction and shared theological concepts. Sacred groves, termed nemeton in Celtic languages, served as the primary venues for Druidic ceremonies and tribal assemblies. These natural sanctuaries typically featured ancient oak trees, springs and clearings where Druids conducted seasonal festivals, legal proceedings and initiation rites. The grove at Anglesey, described by Roman sources as a major Druidic centre, contained altars stained with human blood and sacred trees decorated with human entrails, according to Tacitus's dramatic account. While such descriptions likely contain propagandistic exaggeration, archaeological evidence from similar sites confirms the practice of human sacrifice in specific ritual contexts, particularly during times of crisis or major seasonal transitions. The seasonal festivals of Celtic tradition marked crucial points in the agricultural and pastoral calendar, while serving as occasions for tribal gathering and religious renewal. Samhain, celebrated at the onset of winter around November 1st, mark the beginning of the Celtic New Year and the time when the boundary between the mortal world and the other world became most permeable. Archaeological evidence from hill forts and ritual sites shows increased activity during this period, with large quantities of animal bones indicating communal feasting and sacrifice. The festival's association with the dead appears in burial sites where grave goods were renewed or redistributed during autumn ceremonies, suggesting ongoing relationships between living communities and their ancestors. Imbolc, occurring at the midpoint between winter solstice and spring equinox, celebrated the first stirrings of agricultural renewal and the lactation of ewes. This festival particularly honoured Brigid in her aspect as goddess of fertility and new life. Archaeological evidence from Ireland shows increased activity at sacred wells and springs during early February, with votive deposits of personal ornaments, tools, and food offerings. The lighting of fires and the blessing of seeds for spring planting formed central elements of Imbolc celebrations, with communities gathering at prominent hilltops and sacred sites to participate in collective rituals, ensuring agricultural success. Beltane, marking the beginning of the warm season around May 1st, involved elaborate fire ceremonies designed to purify livestock and ensure their fertility throughout the summer months. Cattle were driven between twin bonfires in rituals that combined practical veterinary care with spiritual protection. Archaeological evidence from pastoral sites across Celtic Europe reveals the remains of these ceremonial fires, often containing the bones of sacrificed animals and charred grain offerings. The sexual symbolism associated with Beltane appears in the archaeological record through phallic stones, fertility figurines, and ritual deposits in wells and springs associated with conception and childbirth. Lughnasadh, celebrated in early August, honoured the god Lugh while marking the beginning of the harvest season. This festival combined athletic competitions, craft demonstrations, and market activities with religious ceremonies acknowledging divine provision and ensuring continued abundance. Archaeological evidence from assembly sites like Tara in Ireland and Lugdunum in Gaul shows extensive temporary structures, cooking areas and craft workshops that accommodated thousands of participants during these annual gatherings. The competitive aspects of Lughnasadh reinforced social hierarchies while providing opportunities for intertribal marriage negotiations and political alliances. Celtic concepts of the otherworld reflected sophisticated theological understanding of multiple reality planes, existing in dynamic relationship with the mortal realm. Unlike the distant heavenly realms of other Indo-European traditions, the Celtic otherworld existed in immediate proximity to ordinary reality, accessible through specific geographical features, temporal conditions, and ritual practices. Sacred islands, underwater palaces, and hollow hills served as entry points to otherworld realms where time moved differently, aging ceased, and supernatural beings maintained courts rivaling those of mortal kings. Ancestor veneration formed a crucial component of Celtic spirituality, with the dead continuing to influence the affairs of their living descendants through prophecy, protection, and judgment. Archaeological evidence from Celtic burial sites reveals ongoing interaction with the deceased through the periodic renewal of grave goods, the construction of memorial structures, and the establishment of cult sites at prominent burial locations. The head cult, documented through numerous archaeological discoveries of isolated skulls in ritual contexts, reflected beliefs about the seat of the soul and the continuing consciousness of the dead. Sacred springs and wells frequently contain deposits of human skulls alongside other votive offerings, suggesting their role as communication channels between living and dead. The concept of thin places, where the boundary between worlds became permeable, governed Celtic understanding of sacred geography and temporal cycles. Natural features like caves, springs, mountains, and ancient trees served as permanent gateways to otherworld realms, while specific times of day and seasonal transitions created temporary opportunities for supernatural contact. Archaeological evidence from these liminal locations reveals intensive ritual activity spanning centuries, with successive generations adding their own offerings and modifications to inherited sacred sites. Irish and Welsh mythological traditions preserve extensive narratives about otherworld journeys, divine interventions, and the complex relationships between mortal heroes and supernatural beings. The Táin Bó Cúailnge, while recorded in medieval manuscripts, contains clearly pre-Christian elements describing divine cattle raids, prophetic dreams, and shape-shifting deities that intervene directly in human affairs. Similarly, the Mabinogion preserves Welsh traditions about otherworld courts, magical cauldrons, and the testing of heroes through supernatural challenges that determine their worthiness for kingship or divine favour. The Germanic religious traditions that dominated northern and central Europe from the early Iron Age through the medieval period represented a sophisticated theological system rooted in concepts of cosmic struggle, divine hierarchy, and the inexorable power of fate. Archaeological evidence from the Jastuf culture, beginning around 600 BC, reveals the earliest distinctly Germanic religious practices emerging from broader Indo-European foundations, while developing unique characteristics suited to the harsh Northern European environment and the warrior-based social structures of Germanic tribes. Weapon deposits in Danish bogs from this period, containing deliberately damaged spears, shields, and swords arranged in ritual formations, demonstrate early Germanic beliefs about offering valuable martial equipment to supernatural powers governing warfare and tribal survival. The Germanic pantheon reflected the complex social and environmental realities faced by tribal communities living in densely forested regions, where winter survival required careful resource management and where intertribal warfare determined territorial control and access to agricultural land. Woden, known as Odin in later Scandinavian sources, emerged as the paramount deity governing wisdom, warfare, death, and the supernatural knowledge necessary for effective leadership. Archaeological evidence of Woden's worship appears in the form of spear-shaped votives, eight-legged horse figurines representing his Mount Sleipnir, and ritual deposits containing ravens' bones and wolf teeth. The Sutton Hoo helmet, with its distinctive boar crest and facial mask design, likely represents regalia associated with Woden worship among Anglo-Saxon elites, combining protective symbolism with divine identification. Woden's character encompassed seemingly contradictory aspects that reflected Germanic understanding of leadership requirements in uncertain times. As the god of wisdom, he possessed knowledge of runes, poetry, and magical practices obtained through personal sacrifice and supernatural ordeal. The myth of Woden hanging himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain runic knowledge appears in later literary sources, but finds archaeological support in ritual deposits of hanged sacrificial victims discovered in Germanic bog sites. Simultaneously, Woden governed the wild hunt, leading hosts of the dead across winter skies in pursuit of supernatural prey. This dual nature as both wise ruler and chaotic force reflected the Germanic understanding that effective leadership required both careful planning and the willingness to embrace dangerous uncertainty. Donar, later known as Thor in Scandinavian tradition, commanded widespread veneration as the protector deity who wielded supernatural weapons against the forces of chaos threatening cosmic order. Archaeological evidence of Donar's worship appears across Germanic Europe in the form of hammer-shaped pendants, miniature axes deposited in ritual contexts, and sacred groves where oak trees received votive offerings. The god's association with thunder and lightning connected him to the fertilizing rains essential for agricultural success, while his role as giant killer positioned him as defender of both divine and human communities against destructive supernatural forces. Roman sources document Germanic warriors invoking Donar before battle, and archaeological evidence from weapon deposits suggests that martial equipment was consecrated to him before major military campaigns. The regional variations in Donar's worship reflected local environmental conditions and tribal traditions, while maintaining core theological concepts. Among continental Germanic tribes, his sacred animal was the goat, evidenced by numerous goat bones found in ritual deposits and the prevalence of goat imagery on ceremonial objects. Scandinavian traditions later associated him with a chariot pulled by 2 goats named Tangrisnir and Tangdjoster, whose daily slaughter and resurrection symbolized the cyclical nature of sacrifice and renewal. Archaeological discoveries of goat skulls arranged in specific patterns at Germanic cult sites support the antiquity of these associations and demonstrate the continuity of religious symbolism across centuries of cultural development. Friha, cognate with the Scandinavian Frigg, governed marriage, fertility, household management, and the complex web of kinship obligations that bound Germanic society together. Her worship centered on domestic spaces and seasonal festivals marking crucial points in the agricultural calendar. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements reveals household shrines containing spinning implements, loom weights, and textile fragments that suggest ritual activities associated with women's work and its supernatural significance. The goddess's association with weaving connected her to concepts of fate and destiny, with Germanic peoples understanding the threads of individual lives as part of a cosmic tapestry woven by divine feminine powers. The concept of weird formed the philosophical foundation of Germanic religious thought, representing a complex understanding of fate that differed significantly from simple predestination. Weird encompassed the accumulated consequences of past actions, both individual and collective, that shaped present circumstances and constrained future possibilities. Archaeological evidence suggests that Germanic peoples actively sought to influence their weird through ritual action, votive offerings, and careful attention to omens and supernatural signs. Runic inscriptions on weapons, jewelry, and memorial stones frequently invoke concepts related to weird, suggesting widespread popular understanding of these theological principles. The Well of Urd, located beneath one of Yggdrasil's three roots, according to later mythological sources, represented the source from which weird flowed throughout the cosmos. The three Norns who tended this well, Urd representing the past, Verdandi the present, and Skuld the future, wove the fates of gods and humans alike. Archaeological evidence from Germanic sacred springs and wells reveals ritual deposits spanning centuries, with successive generations adding offerings to these liminal spaces where supernatural powers were believed to be most accessible. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water sources, particularly weapons and jewellery, demonstrates Germanic understanding of these locations as communication channels with fate-governing deities. Germanic kingship combined political authority with religious responsibility, creating sacred rulers whose legitimacy depended on maintaining proper relationships with supernatural powers. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites reveals the elaborate ritual preparations surrounding Germanic kings, including ship burials, weapon deposits, and human sacrifice designed to ensure the ruler's successful transition to the afterlife and continued protection of his people. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, dating to the early 7th century, exemplifies the fusion of political and religious symbolism in Germanic royal culture, with its combination of Christian and pagan elements, reflecting the complex religious transitions occurring during this period. The institution of sacred kingship required rulers to demonstrate divine favour through military success, agricultural abundance, and the maintenance of cosmic order within their territories. Archaeological evidence from Germanic hill forts and royal centres shows the integration of religious and political functions, with cult sites located within or adjacent to administrative complexes. The king's responsibility for conducting seasonal festivals, mediating disputes, and ensuring proper relationships with supernatural powers made him a crucial intermediary between human and divine realms. Failure in these religious duties could result in loss of divine support and subsequent political overthrow, creating powerful incentives for rulers to maintain orthodox religious practices. Thing assemblies represented the intersection of Germanic legal and religious traditions, combining judicial proceedings with ritual activities designed to ensure divine sanction for human decisions. Archaeological evidence from assembly sites across Germanic Europe reveals the careful spatial organisation of these gatherings, with cult areas, meeting spaces, and ritual deposits arranged according to specific ceremonial requirements. The Olthing site at Thingvellir in Iceland, though from a later period, preserves the basic organisational principles that governed earlier Germanic assemblies, with its combination of legal procedures, religious ceremonies, and communal feasting activities. The religious dimensions of Thing assemblies included oath-taking ceremonies conducted in the presence of sacred objects, the invocation of divine witnesses to legal proceedings, and ritual purification practices designed to ensure that judicial decisions reflected divine will rather than merely human opinion. Archaeological discoveries of ceremonial weapons, oath rings, and other ritual objects from assembly sites demonstrate the material culture associated with these religious legal practices. The integration of supernatural authority into legal proceedings created a system where violation of legal agreements constituted religious transgression, requiring both earthly punishment and divine appeasement. Germanic burial practices evolved throughout the Iron Age and early medieval period, while maintaining consistent theological principles about death, afterlife, and the continuing relationship between living and dead communities. Cremation remained the predominant burial practice among most Germanic tribes, with archaeological evidence revealing elaborate pyre constructions designed to ensure complete consumption of both body and grave goods. The Spong Hill Cemetery in Norfolk contains over 2,400 cremation urns spanning several centuries, demonstrating the continuity of these practices among Anglo-Saxon populations in Britain. The careful arrangement of cremated remains, often mixed with animal bones and melted metal objects, suggests beliefs about the transformation of material substances through fire into forms suitable for otherworld existence. Weapon deposits in rivers, lakes, and bog sites represent one of the most distinctive aspects of Germanic religious practice, with archaeological evidence spanning from the early Iron Age through the Viking period. These offerings typically consisted of complete military equipment sets, including spears, shields, swords, and armour, deliberately damaged or killed before deposition. The Hjortspring boat discovery in Denmark revealed a complete war canoe deposited around 400 BC along with weapons and equipment for an entire war band, suggesting large-scale communal offerings following military victories. Similar discoveries at Illerup, Adel, Aisbol, and Needham demonstrate the continuation of these practices over several centuries, with increasingly elaborate offerings reflecting growing military sophistication and social stratification. The ritual destruction of weapons before offering reveals Germanic theological understanding about the transformation of material objects for supernatural consumption. Archaeological analysis shows that swords were bent, spear points broken, and shield bosses deliberately damaged in ways that would render them useless for human purposes while maintaining their symbolic integrity as offerings. This practice reflects beliefs about the need to kill material objects so they could accompany their owners into otherworld realms, or serve supernatural recipients who existed beyond ordinary material constraints. Bog bodies discovered across northern European peatlands provide direct evidence of human sacrifice practices within Germanic religious traditions. The Tolland man, Graubal man, and numerous other preserved individuals show evidence of ritual killing through hanging, throat cutting, or drowning, often preceded by elaborate preparation, including special meals and grooming. Forensic analysis of stomach contents reveals that many bog body victims consumed ritual meals containing unusual combinations of grains and wild plants, suggesting specific dietary preparations for sacrificial death. The careful placement of bodies in bog environments, often weighted down with stones or wooden stakes, indicates deliberate ritual protocols governing human sacrifice practices. The seasonal timing of bog body depositions correlates with major Germanic religious festivals, particularly those marking agricultural transitions and times of crisis requiring divine intervention. Archaeological evidence suggests that human sacrifice occurred primarily during periods of environmental stress, military threat, or political instability, when normal ritual offerings proved insufficient to ensure divine favour. The social status of bog body victims varies considerably, with some showing evidence of a high-status lifestyle while others appear to have been slaves or captives, suggesting different categories of sacrificial offering appropriate to different circumstances and divine recipients. Votive offerings beyond weapons and human sacrifice encompassed a wide range of valuable objects deposited in ritual contexts throughout Germanic territories. Gold bracteates, thin gold discs decorated with divine imagery and runic inscriptions, appear in hordes across Scandinavia and northern Germany, dating to the migration period. These objects, clearly designed for ritual rather than practical use, often depict scenes of divine horses, supernatural birds, and runic formulas invoking divine protection. The standardized iconography appearing on bracteates from widely separated regions suggests coordinated religious instruction and shared theological concepts maintained across tribal boundaries. Cult houses and temple structures, while less common than natural sacred sites, provide evidence of more formal religious architecture among some Germanic groups. The temple at Uppsala, described in later literary sources as containing images of Odin, Thor and Freya, likely represents the culmination of earlier architectural traditions evidenced by archaeological discoveries of smaller cult buildings. Excavations at Tissø in Denmark revealed a hall complex dating to the 6th through 10th centuries that combined residential, administrative and religious functions, with ritual deposits and cult objects indicating its use for seasonal festivals and religious ceremonies. The integration of religious and secular activities in these structures reflects Germanic understanding of the divine presence within ordinary social life, rather than separation into distinct sacred and profane spheres. The religious traditions of Scandinavia reached their most sophisticated expression during the Viking Age, building upon centuries of Germanic theological development while incorporating unique elements shaped by the region's maritime culture, harsh climate, and complex political structures. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gamla Uppsala in Sweden reveals the evolution of Scandinavian paganism from earlier Germanic foundations into a distinctive religious system characterized by elaborate cosmological concepts, specialized magical practices, and institutional structures that governed both spiritual and temporal affairs throughout the North Germanic world. The Norse cosmological framework centered on Yggdrasil, the world tree, whose immense ash trunk connected 9 distinct realms arranged in 3 vertical tiers. Archaeological evidence supporting this cosmological model appears in the form of ceremonial objects decorated with tree imagery, runic inscriptions referencing the cosmic ash, and ritual deposits placed at the bases of sacred groves where massive ash trees served as earthly manifestations of the cosmic axis. The Överhogdal tapestries from Sweden, dating to the 11th century, depict elaborate tree structures surrounded by human and animal figures, suggesting widespread popular understanding of Yggdrasil's central role in Norse religious thought. Asgard, the uppermost realm housing the Aesir gods, existed at Yggdrasil's crown, accessible to divine beings through the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost. Archaeological representations of this celestial fortress appear on picture stones from Gotland, where carved images show armed figures crossing bridge-like structures toward fortified enclosures. The concept of Asgard as a divine stronghold reflected Scandinavian understanding of the gods as a warrior aristocracy engaged in constant preparation for the final battle of Ragnarok. Excavations at Scandinavian royal centres reveal architectural features that deliberately mimic divine hall construction, with rulers positioning themselves as earthly representatives of Odin's court through the symbolic replication of Asgard's physical arrangements. Midgard, the middle realm inhabited by humans, occupied the central position on Yggdrasil's trunk, surrounded by the vast ocean where the Midgard serpent Jormungandr lay coiled around the world's circumference. This cosmological arrangement positioned humanity at the intersection of divine and chaotic forces, requiring constant vigilance and proper ritual observance to maintain cosmic balance. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian settlements shows the integration of cosmological symbolism into domestic architecture, with hearths positioned to represent the central axis and doorways oriented towards significant astronomical phenomena that connected earthly dwellings to cosmic structures. The 9 realms included specialized domains for different categories of beings and supernatural forces. Alfheim housed the Light Elves, beneficial supernatural entities associated with fertility and prosperity, while Svartalfheim contained the Dark Elves or dwarves whose mastery of metalworking and craftsmanship produced the magical weapons and artifacts used by gods and heroes. Archaeological evidence of elf worship appears in Scandinavian place names containing the element alf, and in ritual deposits of miniature tools and weapons that suggest offerings to supernatural craftsmen. The distinction between light and dark elves reflected Norse understanding of the dual nature of supernatural assistance, which could prove either beneficial or dangerous depending on proper ritual approach and moral conduct. Jotunheim, the realm of giants, represented the forces of chaos and destruction that constantly threatened cosmic order. These beings possessed immense strength and magical powers, but lacked the wisdom and self-control that characterized divine authority. Archaeological representations of giants appear on carved stone monuments and metalwork, typically depicting them as massive humanoid figures wielding clubs or other primitive weapons. The ongoing conflict between gods and giants formed the central narrative tension in Norse mythology, with each divine victory serving only as a temporary postponement of the inevitable final confrontation at Ragnarok. Vanaheim housed the Vanir gods, a separate divine family associated with fertility, prosperity and wisdom, who had been integrated into the Aesir pantheon through ancient treaties and hostage exchanges. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vanir worship predated the dominance of Odin and the Aesir in Scandinavian religion, with fertility symbols and agricultural ritual deposits appearing in contexts that predate the warrior-focused religious practices characteristic of the Viking Age. The theological integration of Vanir and Aesir deities reflected historical processes of cultural synthesis as different Scandinavian tribes unified under common political and religious frameworks. Helheim, ruled by the goddess Hel, served as the destination for those who died of disease, old age, or other non-heroic causes. Unlike the Christian concept of hell as a place of punishment, Helheim functioned as a neutral realm where the ordinary dead continued existence in conditions resembling their earthly circumstances. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian burial sites reveals provisions for afterlife existence, including food, tools, and personal possessions that suggest beliefs about continued material needs in the realm of the dead. The goddess Hel herself, depicted as half living and half corpse, embodied the liminal nature of death as a transition rather than an ending. Ragnarok, the prophesied destruction and renewal of the cosmos, formed the eschatological framework that gave meaning to all Norse religious activity. This final battle would begin with the Fimbul Winter, 3 consecutive years of harsh cold that would destroy social bonds and trigger universal warfare. Archaeological evidence from the 6th century AD reveals widespread social disruption and climate deterioration that may have influenced the development of Ragnarok mythology, with abandoned settlements and mass grave sites suggesting the kind of civilizational collapse that Norse theology projected onto cosmic scales. The death of Balder, beloved son of Odin and Frigg, served as the crucial precipitating event for Ragnarok, demonstrating how individual actions could have cosmic consequences. Balder's invulnerability to all substances except mistletoe, obtained through his mother's oaths from every object in creation, reflected Norse understanding of the interconnectedness of all existence and the dangerous consequences of overlooking seemingly insignificant details. Loki's orchestration of Balder's death through the blind god Hodder represented the principle that evil often operates through manipulation of innocence and ignorance, rather than direct confrontation. The binding of Loki following Balder's death illustrated Norse concepts of justice and the temporary nature of cosmic order. The god's punishment of Loki, chaining him beneath a serpent that dripped venom onto his face, would continue until Ragnarok, when he would break free to lead the forces of chaos against divine authority. Archaeological representations of bound figures appear on carved stones and metalwork throughout Scandinavia, suggesting popular familiarity with this mythological episode and its theological significance. The cyclical nature of binding and release reflected Norse understanding of cosmic time as alternating periods of order and chaos rather than linear progression toward ultimate resolution. The Völuspá, preserved in the Poetic Edda, provides the most complete account of Norse cosmological cycles, describing the creation of the world from the body of the primordial giant Ymir, the establishment of divine order, and the eventual return to chaos and subsequent renewal. Archaeological evidence supports elements of this Cretan mythology, particularly the emphasis on sacrifice and transformation as fundamental cosmic principles. Ritual deposits containing dismembered animal remains arranged in specific patterns suggest ceremonial reenactments of Cretan mythology, with participants symbolically participating in the ongoing maintenance of cosmic order through proper ritual observance. The concept of cosmic cycles reflected Scandinavian observation of natural phenomena, particularly the dramatic seasonal changes that characterise northern European climate. The alternation between the long darkness of winter and the continuous daylight of summer provided a natural model for understanding cosmic alternation between periods of divine control and chaotic disruption. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian cult sites reveals seasonal ritual activities designed to support divine forces during their periodic struggles against chaotic powers, with winter solstice ceremonies receiving particular emphasis as crucial moments requiring human assistance to ensure the sun's return. Bloat sacrifices form the central ritual practice of Norse religion, encompassing both regular seasonal offerings and special ceremonies conducted during times of crisis or major undertakings. Archaeological evidence from cult sites across Scandinavia reveals the material remains of these sacrificial feasts, including large quantities of animal bones showing evidence of ritual slaughter and consumption. Cooking facilities capable of preparing food for hundreds of participants, and specialized vessels used for collecting and distributing sacrificial blood. The term blot itself derives from a root meaning to strengthen, indicating the theological understanding that these rituals provided supernatural nourishment to divine powers while creating bonds of reciprocity between gods and worshippers. Seasonal blots marked crucial transitions in the agricultural and pastoral calendar, while serving as occasions for community gathering and religious renewal. The winter night sacrifice, conducted at the beginning of winter, honoured the ancestral spirits and fertility deities whose continued favour would ensure survival through the harsh months ahead. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased activity at burial sites and ancestral monuments, with offerings of food, drink, and valuable objects deposited at graves and memorial stones. The practice of inviting deceased family members to participate in winter nights feasts appears in literary sources and finds archaeological support in the form of extra place settings and food portions discovered in ritual contexts. The Disablo honoured the female spirits known as Disir, supernatural beings who served as guardians of families, tribes, and individuals. These ceremonies typically occurred in early spring and involved exclusively female participation, with women conducting rituals in sacred groves or at household shrines dedicated to ancestral mothers and protective spirits. Archaeological evidence of Disir worship appears in the form of female figurines deposited in ritual contexts, spinning and weaving implements found in cult sites, and specialized buildings that may have served as women's ceremonial spaces. The social importance of Ditza worship reflected the crucial role of women in maintaining family honor, managing household resources, and ensuring the continuation of kinship lines. Cedar magic represented the most sophisticated and controversial aspect of Norse religious practice, involving techniques for manipulating supernatural forces, communicating with spirits, and altering the fabric of reality itself. Practitioners of cedar known as Seed Kona or Seed Mada, possessed specialized knowledge of trance induction, spirit possession, and divination practices that allowed them to transcend ordinary consciousness and interact directly with supernatural beings. Archaeological evidence of cedar practice appears in the form of ritual staffs, iron rods topped with ornamental heads that served as focusing implements for magical operations. The clinter staff from Oland, decorated with intricate animal designs and runic inscriptions, exemplifies the sophisticated craftsmanship invested in these magical implements. The practice of cedar involved specific ritual protocols, including the construction of high seats or platforms where practitioners conducted their magical operations, while surrounded by assistants who provided musical accompaniment and ritual support. Archaeological excavations at cult sites have revealed elevated platforms and circular arrangements of stones that may have served as cedar performance spaces. The Oseberg ship burial contained a complete set of cedar equipment, including iron staffs, ritual textiles, and a ceremonial wagon that may have been used for travelling between cult sites. The high-status nature of this burial suggests that cedar practice was associated with political and religious authority rather than marginal social positions. Volvas, female practitioners of cedar magic, held particularly important positions in Norse society as prophets, healers, and advisors to kings and chieftains. These women travelled between communities, providing divination services, conducting healing rituals, and offering guidance on important decisions affecting entire tribes or kingdoms. Archaeological evidence of vulva burials reveals distinctive grave goods, including iron staffs, unusual textile fragments, and collections of amulets and magical implements that distinguish these individuals from ordinary female burials. The Firkat vulva burial in Denmark contained a complete set of magical equipment along with evidence of high social status, including imported goods and elaborate personal ornaments. The vulva's prophetic abilities were understood to derive from their capacity to enter trance states that allowed communication with supernatural beings possessing knowledge of future events. Literary sources describe the formal protocols governing vulva consultations, including the preparation of special seating, the singing of specific songs, and the provision of ritual meals designed to facilitate supernatural contact. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts through discoveries of specialized furniture, musical instruments, and cooking equipment found in contexts associated with magical practice. Runic traditions formed an integral component of Norse religious and magical practice, with the alphabet itself understood as a divine gift obtained by Odin through personal sacrifice and supernatural ordeal. The 24 runes of the Elder Futhark each possessed individual names, meanings, and magical properties that could be combined in various ways to create powerful inscriptions capable of affecting both material and spiritual reality. Archaeological evidence of runic magic appears throughout Scandinavia in the form of inscribed weapons, jewellery, memorial stones, and wooden objects that demonstrate the widespread use of runic writing for both mundane and supernatural purposes. The Kilva stone from Gotland contains the complete Elder Futhark sequence, along with additional magical symbols, suggesting its use as a teaching tool or reference guide for runic practitioners. Similar inscriptions appear on weapons and personal ornaments, indicating that knowledge of runic writing and magic extended beyond specialized practitioners to include ordinary warriors and craftsmen who incorporated runic formulas into their daily activities. The standardization of runic forms across vast geographical distances demonstrates the existence of coordinated educational systems that maintained consistency in both writing practices and magical applications. Divination through rune casting involved the random selection of marked stones or wooden pieces whose combinations provided insight into future events or guidance for important decisions. Archaeological discoveries of sets of small marked objects, including bone pieces, stones, and wooden discs, suggest the material implements used for runic divination. The practice required specialized knowledge of runic meanings, interpretive techniques, and the proper ritual protocols for conducting divination sessions. Literary sources describe the careful preparation required for runic divination, including purification rituals, invocation of appropriate deities, and the creation of sacred space where supernatural communication could occur safely. The integration of writing, magic, and religious practice in Scandinavian culture created a unique synthesis where literacy itself possessed supernatural dimensions and where the act of inscription could alter reality through the manipulation of cosmic forces. Runic inscriptions on weapons often contained formulas designed to increase their effectiveness in battle, while memorial stones used runic magic to ensure the continued honour of the deceased and the protection of their surviving family members. This understanding of writing as a form of magical technology distinguished Norse runic practice from purely utilitarian writing systems and connected literacy to the broader framework of religious and magical knowledge that governed Scandinavian spiritual life. Goda served as the primary religious officials in Norse society, combining priestly functions with political authority and legal responsibility for maintaining proper relationships between human communities and supernatural powers. Unlike professional priesthoods found in other religious traditions, Godar typically held their positions through inheritance or appointment by local assemblies, with their religious authority deriving from family tradition, personal charisma, and demonstrated effectiveness in conducting ritual activities. Archaeological evidence of Godar activities appears in the form of cult sites associated with prominent families, specialized religious equipment found in high-status burials, and architectural features in elite residences that suggest the integration of religious and domestic functions. The religious landscape of Slavic Europe emerged from the dense forests and river valleys of Eastern Europe as distinct tribal confederations developed sophisticated theological systems governing agricultural cycles, warrior societies, and the complex relationships between human communities and the supernatural forces inhabiting the natural world. Archaeological evidence from the Prague Korchak culture, beginning around 500 AD, reveals the earliest recognizable Slavic religious practices characterized by cremation burials, ritual deposits in rivers and springs, and the construction of wooden cult structures that would become hallmarks of Slavic paganism throughout its historical development. Excavations at sites like Zimno in Ukraine have uncovered elaborate ritual complexes featuring multiple wooden temples, sacrificial areas, and deposits of weapons and jewelry that demonstrate the sophisticated organizational structures underlying Slavic religious practice. Perun dominated the Slavic pantheon as the supreme deity governing thunder, warfare, and divine justice, wielding supernatural weapons to maintain cosmic order against the forces of chaos and destruction. Archaeological evidence of Perun's worship appears throughout Slavic territories in the form of oak groves containing ritual deposits, stone axes buried in sacred contexts, and wooden idols whose remains have been preserved in waterlogged environments. The primary chronicle describes Prince Vladimir's establishment of Perun's cult center in Kiev around 980 AD, featuring a massive wooden idol with a silver head and golden moustache surrounded by perpetual fires tended by dedicated priests. Excavations in Kiev have revealed the foundations of this temple complex, along with evidence of large-scale animal sacrifice and ritual feasting that accompanied major religious festivals. The thunder god's association with oak trees created sacred groves throughout Slavic territories where communities gathered for seasonal celebrations, legal proceedings, and military ceremonies requiring divine sanction. Archaeological evidence from sites like Perun near Novgorod reveals circular temple complexes surrounded by oak groves, with central fire altars where animal sacrifices were conducted during major festivals. The careful arrangement of these cult sites, with their combination of natural and constructed elements, demonstrates Slavic understanding of sacred space as requiring both divine presence in natural features and human architectural enhancement to create appropriate venues for supernatural communication. Perun's role as divine warrior and protector of cosmic order manifested in his ongoing conflict with Veles, the chthonic deity governing cattle, wealth, and the underworld forces that threatened agricultural prosperity and social stability. This cosmic struggle between sky and earth powers provided the mythological framework for understanding natural phenomena like thunderstorms, which were interpreted as battles between Perun's lightning weapons and Veles's serpentine forms. Archaeological evidence supporting this theological dualism appears in ritual deposits containing both iron weapons associated with Perun and organic materials like cattle bones and grain offerings linked to Vela's worship, often found in the same sacred sites but arranged in distinct spatial patterns reflecting their opposing natures. Veles commanded widespread veneration among Slavic agricultural communities as the deity governing livestock prosperity, trade relationships, and the fertility of both animals and crops. His cult centres typically featured natural springs, marshy areas, and low-lying meadows where cattle grazed, contrasting with Perun's elevated oak groves and hilltop temples. Archaeological excavations at Veles cult sites reveal distinctive offerings including cattle skulls arranged in specific patterns, bronze and silver ornaments depicting serpentine motifs, and wooden figurines representing both human and animal forms. The god's association with wealth and prosperity appears in hoards of silver coins and jewellery deposited in wetland areas, suggesting ritual offerings designed to ensure continued economic success. The theological relationship between Perun and Veles extended beyond simple opposition to encompass complementary functions essential for community survival and prosperity. Perun's control over rainfall and storm systems provided the water necessary for crop growth, while Veles governed the earth's fertility and the successful transformation of seeds into harvest abundance. Archaeological evidence from Slavic agricultural settlements shows ritual activities designed to honour both deities during crucial periods of the farming calendar, with spring ceremonies invoking Veles for successful planting and summer festivals appealing to Perun for appropriate weather conditions. Mokosh emerged as the primary female deity in the Slavic pantheon, governing women's work, household management, fertility, and the complex web of kinship relationships that bound communities together. Her worship centered on domestic spaces and activities associated with textile production, food preparation, and child rearing, with archaeological evidence appearing in the form of spindle whorls, loom weights, and other implements associated with women's work found in ritual contexts. Excavations at Slavic settlements reveal household shrines containing female figurines, often depicted with exaggerated sexual characteristics and holding symbols of fertility like grain sheaves or nursing infants. The goddess's association with spinning and weaving connected her to concepts of fate and destiny, with Slavic peoples understanding individual lives as threads woven into the cosmic fabric by divine feminine powers. Archaeological evidence of this theological concept appears in burial sites where textile implements accompany female interments, often arranged in patterns suggesting continued weaving activities in the afterlife. The practice of depositing spindle whorls and loom weights in wells and springs indicates beliefs about Mokosh's control over the sources of both water and the metaphorical threads of human destiny. Mokosh's role as protector of women during childbirth and guardian of infant survival made her worship particularly important for ensuring community continuity and population growth. Archaeological evidence from Slavic cemeteries reveals high rates of infant and maternal mortality that would have made divine protection during childbirth a crucial concern for all families. Votive offerings associated with Mokosh worship include miniature cradles, infant clothing, and amulets designed to protect mothers and children from supernatural threats during the vulnerable period surrounding birth. Sverog represented the divine smith whose mastery of fire and metalworking provided the technological foundations for Slavic material culture and military effectiveness. His worship combined reverence for the transformative power of fire with recognition of the specialized knowledge required for successful metallurgy, creating cult practices that honored both the supernatural and technical aspects of smithcraft. Archaeological evidence of Svarog worship appears in the form of smiths' tools deposited in ritual contexts, forge sites containing unusual arrangements of metalworking debris, and ceremonial objects displaying sophisticated craftsmanship that suggests divine inspiration or supernatural assistance. The gods' association with the sun and celestial fire connected earthly smithing activities to cosmic processes of creation and transformation. Slavic cosmological concepts understood the sun as Svarog's forge, where divine weapons were created and where the raw materials of existence were shaped into their final forms. Archaeological evidence supporting these theological connections appears in solar symbols incorporated into metalwork designs, forge orientations that align with significant astronomical phenomena, and ritual deposits of metalworking tools arranged to reflect celestial patterns. Svarog's role as divine lawgiver and maintainer of cosmic order manifested through his creation of the fundamental principles governing both natural processes and human social organization. The gods' establishment of marriage customs, property rights, and legal procedures provided the supernatural foundation for Slavic social institutions, with violations of these divine laws requiring ritual purification and supernatural intervention to restore proper cosmic balance. Archaeological evidence of legal and religious integration appears in thing sites, where judicial proceedings were conducted in the presence of sacred objects and where ritual deposits mark the locations of important legal decisions. Regional variations in Slavic religious practice reflected the diverse environmental conditions and cultural influences encountered as Slavic tribes expanded across Eastern Europe from their original homeland in the Pripyat marshes. Western Slavic groups, influenced by contact with Germanic and Celtic populations, developed distinctive cult practices emphasizing warrior deities and martial symbolism. Archaeological evidence from sites like Arkona on Rugen Island reveals massive temple complexes dedicated to Svantovit, a four-headed deity governing war, divination and agricultural prosperity, whose worship combined Slavic theological concepts with architectural and artistic influences from neighbouring cultures. The temple at Arkona, described in medieval chronicles as containing a massive wooden idol surrounded by purple curtains and tended by white horses used for divination, represents the most sophisticated example of Western Slavic religious architecture. Archaeological excavations have revealed the temple's foundations, along with evidence of elaborate ritual activities including large-scale animal sacrifice, communal feasting, and the maintenance of sacred fires. The site's strategic location on coastal cliffs overlooking the Baltic Sea reflects the integration of religious and political functions, with the temple serving as both cult centre and symbol of Slavic resistance to Christian conversion efforts. Eastern Slavic traditions developed distinctive characteristics influenced by contact with Finno-Ugric populations, nomadic steppe peoples, and Byzantine Christian culture. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Dnieper River reveals cult practices emphasizing water deities, ancestral spirits, and fertility goddesses whose worship incorporated elements borrowed from neighboring traditions while maintaining recognizably Slavic theological foundations. The integration of foreign religious elements appears in artistic motifs, ritual implements, and architectural features that combine Slavic symbolic systems with decorative and functional elements derived from other cultural traditions. Southern Slavic religious practices evolved under the influence of Byzantine, Thracian, and Illyrian cultural contacts, creating distinctive regional variants while preserving core theological concepts shared across the broader Slavic world. Archaeological evidence from the Balkans reveals cult sites featuring stone circles, cave sanctuaries, and mountaintop temples that reflect the region's distinctive topography and its influence on religious practice. The worship of mountain deities, storm gods, and chthonic powers associated with underground waters demonstrates the adaptation of Slavic religious concepts to local environmental conditions and pre-existing sacred sites. Seasonal festivals formed the backbone of Slavic religious practice, marking crucial transitions in the agricultural calendar while serving as occasions for community gathering, ritual renewal, and the reinforcement of social bonds through shared religious activities. Maslenitsa, celebrated during the week preceding Lent in later Christian contexts but clearly preserving pre-Christian elements, mark the transition from winter to spring through elaborate ceremonies involving the burning of straw effigies, ritual combat, and communal feasting designed to drive away winter spirits and welcome the returning fertility of the earth. Archaeological evidence of Maslenitsa-type celebrations appears in the form of large cooking areas, fire pits containing burned organic materials, and deposits of broken pottery and food, remains that suggest massive communal gatherings. The practice of creating and destroying anthropomorphic figures during these festivals finds archaeological support in discoveries of deliberately broken figurines and burned wooden objects arranged in specific patterns at cult sites. The integration of martial and fertility symbolism in these celebrations reflects Slavic understanding of the connection between successful warfare and agricultural prosperity. Kupala Night, celebrated during the summer solstice, combined solar worship with fertility rituals emphasizing the magical properties of water, fire and plant life during the period of maximum natural power. Archaeological evidence of Kupala celebrations appears in waterside cult sites containing fire altars, floral offerings, and ritual deposits of personal ornaments that suggest ceremonial bathing and purification activities. The practice of jumping over bonfires and searching for magical fern flowers finds archaeological support in the discovery of burned organic materials and unusual plant remains in ritual contexts associated with midsummer festivals. The festival's emphasis on romantic and sexual themes appears in archaeological evidence including paired burials, fertility amulets, and artistic representations of couples engaged in ritual activities. The temporary suspension of normal social restrictions during Kupala Night created opportunities for courtship, marriage negotiations, and the formation of new social alliances that strengthened community bonds while ensuring genetic diversity within tribal populations. Archaeological evidence of these social functions appears in the form of exchange goods, imported ornaments, and evidence of feast preparations that would have facilitated inter-community contact and relationship formation. Harvest festivals mark the culmination of the agricultural year and provided occasions for thanksgiving to the deities whose favour had ensured successful crop production. These celebrations combined practical activities like grain processing and food preservation, with ritual observances designed to maintain divine favour for future agricultural cycles. Archaeological evidence of harvest festivals appears in large storage facilities, communal cooking areas, and ritual deposits of first fruits and grain offerings found at cult sites throughout Slavic territories. The practice of creating grain dollies and other anthropomorphic representations of harvest spirits finds archaeological support in discoveries of woven organic materials, carved wooden figures, and ceramic objects designed to represent supernatural beings associated with agricultural fertility. These ritual objects were often kept throughout the winter months before being burned or buried during spring planting ceremonies, creating annual cycles of creation, preservation, and destruction that mirrored the natural processes governing crop production. Ancestor veneration formed a crucial component of Slavic religious practice, with deceased family members continuing to influence the affairs of their living descendants through protection, guidance, and intervention in times of crisis. Archaeological evidence of ancestor worship appears in household shrines, memorial meals conducted at burial sites, and the practice of maintaining connections with the dead through regular offerings and communication rituals. Slavic burial practices evolved throughout the pre-Christian period, while maintaining consistent emphasis on providing deceased individuals with the material goods and spiritual preparation necessary for successful afterlife existence. The concept of domovoi and other household spirits reflected Slavic understanding of the continuing presence of ancestral powers within domestic spaces, requiring regular attention and propitiation to ensure household harmony and prosperity. Archaeological evidence of household spirit worship appears in the form of small offerings deposited in corners of buildings, under thresholds, and in storage areas where these invisible residents were believed to maintain their earthly presence. The practice of leaving food offerings, maintaining clean living spaces, and conducting regular purification rituals created ongoing relationships between living families and their supernatural household guardians. Sacred groves and natural springs served as primary venues for Slavic religious activities, with these natural features understood as dwelling places of supernatural beings requiring human attention and propitiation. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals centuries of ritual activity, with successive generations adding their own offerings and modifications to inherited sacred spaces. The practice of hanging cloth strips, depositing coins and jewellery, and conducting healing rituals at sacred springs continued well into the Christian period, demonstrating the persistence of these religious traditions despite official conversion efforts. Wooden idols represented the most distinctive aspect of Slavic religious material culture, with these carved representations of deities serving as focal points for ritual activities and repositories of divine presence within human communities. Archaeological preservation of wooden objects in waterlogged environments has provided direct evidence of Slavic sculptural traditions, revealing sophisticated carving techniques and complex iconographic systems that conveyed theological concepts through visual symbolism. The Zbruch idol, discovered in Ukraine and dating to the 10th century, displays four-faced design with multiple tiers representing different cosmic levels and divine functions. The practice of creating and maintaining wooden idols required specialized craftsmen who possessed both technical skills and religious knowledge, necessary for producing objects capable of housing divine presence. Archaeological evidence of idol production appears in the form of specialized carving tools, wood chips and shavings arranged in ritual patterns, and workshop areas associated with cult sites where religious sculptors conducted their sacred work. The temporary nature of wooden sculptures, requiring regular replacement and renewal, created ongoing relationships between communities and their craftsmen, while ensuring that religious art remained connected to living theological traditions rather than becoming fossilized historical artifacts. The destruction of wooden idols during Christianization efforts provides archaeological evidence of the violent religious transitions that characterized the conversion period. Sites like Kiev and Novgorod contain burned wooden fragments, deliberately broken sculptural elements, and evidence of systematic destruction activities that accompanied the establishment of Christian religious authority. The careful burial or water deposition of some idol fragments suggests attempts by pagan populations to preserve sacred objects from destruction while maintaining their religious potency through appropriate ritual treatment. Dual faith practices emerged throughout Slavic territories as Christian conversion efforts encountered established pagan traditions, creating syncretic religious systems that combined Christian theological concepts with traditional Slavic ritual practices and supernatural beliefs. Archaeological evidence of religious syncretism appears in the form of Christian symbols incorporated into traditional craft designs, church buildings constructed on former pagan cult sites, and burial practices that combine Christian and pagan elements in single interments. The persistence of pre-Christian religious concepts within officially Christian communities created complex theological situations that required ongoing negotiation between competing religious authorities. The practice of maintaining traditional seasonal festivals within Christian calendrical frameworks allowed Slavic communities to preserve essential agricultural and social rituals while satisfying the requirements of Christian religious observance. Archaeological evidence of this religious adaptation appears in church sites containing pre-Christian ritual deposits, Christian artistic motifs that incorporate traditional Slavic symbolic elements, and burial practices that suggest continued belief in pre-Christian afterlife concepts, despite official Christian doctrine. The flexibility of both Christian and pagan religious systems enable their coexistence and gradual integration, rather than the complete replacement of traditional practices with imported religious forms. The Baltic religious traditions of Lithuania, Latvia, and Prussia developed along the southeastern shores of the Baltic Sea as distinct theological systems that preserved some of the most archaic Indo-European religious concepts, while adapting to the unique environmental conditions of dense forests, extensive wetlands, and seasonal agricultural cycles that characterize the region. Archaeological evidence from the Balt's cultural homeland reveals religious practices extending back to the early Iron Age, with sites like Kanav in Lithuania containing ritual deposits spanning over a millennium and demonstrating remarkable continuity in sacred site usage, despite changing political circumstances and external pressures. The Balt's geographical position between Scandinavian, Slavic, and Germanic cultural zones created opportunities for religious exchange, while their relative isolation in forested territories allowed for the preservation of theological concepts that had been modified or abandoned in other Indo-European traditions. Perkunas dominated the Baltic pantheon as the supreme thunder deity, whose control over storm systems, rainfall, and atmospheric phenomena made him the most crucial supernatural power for agricultural communities dependent on proper weather patterns for crop survival. Archaeological evidence of Perkunas worship appears throughout Baltic territories in the form of oak groves containing ritual deposits, stone axes buried in sacred contexts, and hilltop cult sites where communities gathered during thunderstorms to witness divine manifestations. The gods' association with oak trees created extensive sacred forests where no wood could be harvested and where ritual activities continued for centuries, with some groves maintaining their sacred status well into the Christian period, despite official conversion efforts. The thunder god's weapons included supernatural hammers, axes, and iron rods that he wielded against demons, evil spirits, and the forces of chaos threatening cosmic order. Archaeological discoveries of miniature iron axes, hammer pendants, and specially crafted iron rods in ritual contexts demonstrate the material culture associated with Perkunas worship. These objects often display distinctive forging techniques and decorative elements that distinguish them from ordinary tools, suggesting specialized production by craftsmen who understood their religious significance. The practice of burying iron implements in fields during thunderstorms, documented in ethnographic sources and supported by archaeological finds, reflects beliefs about Perkunas' weapons falling to earth during his battles with supernatural enemies. Perkunas' sacred fire traditions represented one of the most distinctive aspects of Baltic religious practice, with eternal flames maintained at major cult centres under the supervision of specialized priestesses who dedicated their lives to ensuring the fires never extinguished. The most famous of these sacred fires burned at Vilnius, where, according to medieval chroniclers, virgin priestesses tended a perpetual flame in a temple surrounded by oak groves where no unauthorized person could enter without facing divine punishment. Archaeological excavations in the Vilnius area have revealed the foundations of circular stone structures containing fire altars and deposits of ash mixed with burned offerings that accumulated over centuries of continuous ritual activity. The priestesses responsible for maintaining Perkunas' sacred fires, known as Veidelutes, underwent rigorous training and initiation processes that prepared them for their crucial religious responsibilities. These women possess specialized knowledge of fire maintenance techniques, ritual protocols, and the complex ceremonial calendar that governed when specific offerings should be made and particular ceremonies conducted. Archaeological evidence of their activities appears in the form of specialized fire-making tools, ceramic vessels designed for ritual use, and living quarters adjacent to temple complexes that house the priestesses and their assistants. The high status of these religious officials is reflected in their elaborate burials, which contain imported goods, precious metals, and symbols of religious authority that distinguish them from ordinary female interments. The eternal flames served multiple functions beyond simple divine worship, acting as a community focal point for major festivals, a source of sacred fire for household hearths, and a symbol of tribal continuity that connected present generations to their ancestral traditions. The practice of carrying fire from Paganism's eternal flame to light household hearths during seasonal festivals created spiritual connections between domestic spaces and the central cult site, while ensuring that divine power permeated every aspect of community life. Archaeological evidence of this practice appears in specialized fire-carrying vessels, torch fragments found along routes between cult sites and settlements, and household hearths that show evidence of ritual preparation and special treatment during festival periods. The maintenance of sacred fires required extensive logistical support, including the provision of specific types of wood, the preparation of ritual offerings, and the coordination of complex ceremonial activities that involved entire communities during major festivals. Oakwood held particular significance for Paganism's fires, with archaeological evidence revealing the selective harvesting of oak from sacred groves for use in temple fires, while other species were reserved for domestic purposes. The careful management of forest resources for religious purposes created sophisticated silviculture practices that maintained the health of sacred groves while providing the materials necessary for ongoing ritual activities. Lema emerged as the primary goddess governing fate, childbirth, and the protection of women during the vulnerable periods surrounding pregnancy and infant care. Her worship centered on natural springs, crossroads, and domestic spaces where women gathered to seek divine assistance during life's crucial transitions. Archaeological evidence of Lema worship appears in the form of silver and bronze jewelry deposited at springs, textile implements found in ritual contexts, and household shrines containing female figurines, often depicted holding symbols of fertility and protection. The goddess's association with weaving and spinning connected her to concepts of fate as threads woven into the cosmic fabric, with individual destinies understood as part of a larger pattern created by divine feminine powers. The goddess's role as protector of mothers and infants made her worship particularly important in societies where maternal and infant mortality rates remained high throughout the pre-Christian period. Archaeological evidence from Baltic cemeteries reveals the prevalence of female burials containing obstetric tools, infant clothing, and amulets designed to provide supernatural protection during childbirth. The practice of depositing placental remains and umbilical cords at sacred sites created ongoing connections between newborn children and the divine powers that had overseen their successful birth, with these ritual deposits found in springs and groves associated with Lema worship. Lema's prophetic abilities manifested through her control over the timing and circumstances of birth, with Baltic peoples understanding that the moment of birth determined an individual's fate and future prospects. The goddess's presence during childbirth required careful ritual preparation, including the purification of birth spaces, the preparation of appropriate offerings, and the performance of ceremonies designed to ensure divine favour during labour and delivery. Archaeological evidence of birth rituals appears in specialised ceramic vessels, silver amulets depicting protective symbols, and arrangements of stones and other objects that created sacred spaces within domestic buildings where births could occur under divine protection. The goddess's association with crossroads reflected Baltic understanding of these liminal spaces as locations where supernatural powers could be most easily contacted and where important decisions affecting individual and community fate could receive divine guidance. Archaeological evidence from crossroads sites reveals ritual deposits spanning centuries, with offerings including personal ornaments, tools, and food remains that suggest regular ceremonial activities conducted at these locations. The practice of erecting wooden posts or stone markers at significant crossroads created permanent focal points for Lima worship, while marking important routes and territorial boundaries that required divine protection. Xamena represented the earth goddess whose control over agricultural fertility, soil productivity, and the seasonal cycles of death and rebirth made her worship essential for farming communities throughout Baltic territories. Her cult sites typically featured natural depressions, springs, and fertile valleys where communities conducted agricultural ceremonies designed to ensure successful planting, growing, and harvest seasons. Archaeological evidence of Xamena worship appears in the form of grain offerings deposited in pits, agricultural tools buried in ritual contexts, and stone circles marking sacred areas where seasonal festivals were conducted. The goddess's association with the earth's fertility required ongoing ritual attention throughout the agricultural calendar, with specific ceremonies marking crucial transitions like spring planting, midsummer growth, and autumn harvest. Archaeological evidence reveals the complexity of these agricultural rituals through discoveries of specialized ploughing tools, seed containers, and harvest implements that were consecrated through ritual processes before use in farming activities. The practice of offering first fruits to Xamena before consuming new crops created annual cycles of thanksgiving and renewal that maintained proper relationships between human communities and the supernatural powers governing agricultural success. Xamena's role as Earth Mother extended beyond simple agricultural functions to encompass broader concepts of territorial protection, tribal identity, and the sacred nature of ancestral lands that had been blessed by generations of proper ritual observance. The goddess's presence in specific locations created sacred territories where particular agricultural techniques, settlement patterns, and resource management practices were required to maintain divine favour. Archaeological evidence of territorial sanctification appears in boundary markers, ritual deposits along territorial edges, and cult sites that mark the centres of tribal territories where Xamena's power was most concentrated. The earth goddess's connection to death and burial practices reflected Baltic understanding of the earth as both the source of life and the destination of the dead, with proper burial ensuring that deceased individuals could continue to contribute to the fertility of their ancestral lands. Archaeological evidence from Baltic cemeteries reveals burial practices designed to facilitate the return of human remains to the earth in ways that enhanced rather than diminished soil fertility. The practice of burying agricultural tools, grain offerings, and symbols of fertility with deceased farmers created connections between individual deaths and ongoing agricultural prosperity. Baltic seasonal rituals demonstrated sophisticated understanding of astronomical phenomena and their relationship to agricultural cycles, with communities conducting elaborate ceremonies timed to coincide with solstices, equinoxes, and other significant celestial events that marked crucial transitions in the natural world. Archaeological evidence of astronomical observation appears in the form of stone circles, wooden posts, and other markers that align with significant celestial phenomena and that served as calendrical devices for timing religious and agricultural activities. The integration of astronomical knowledge with religious practice created complex ceremonial calendars that coordinated community activities while ensuring that ritual observances occurred at the most auspicious times. The spring equinox marked the beginning of the agricultural year and required elaborate ceremonies designed to awaken the earth from winter dormancy while invoking divine blessing for successful planting seasons. Archaeological evidence of spring festivals appears in the form of large cooking areas, deposits of burned organic materials, and arrangements of stones and wooden objects that created sacred spaces for community gatherings. The practice of conducting ritual ploughing ceremonies, documented in ethnographic sources and supported by archaeological discoveries of ceremonial ploughing equipment, demonstrates the integration of practical agricultural activities with religious observances designed to ensure divine cooperation in farming endeavours. Summer solstice celebrations emphasise the peak of solar power and the maximum fertility of the natural world, with communities gathering at hilltop sites and sacred groves to participate in fire ceremonies, ritual bathing, and the collection of magical plants whose potency reached its highest levels during midsummer. Archaeological evidence of solstice activities includes fire altars, bathing pools, and deposits of plant remains that suggest large-scale gathering and processing of the medicinal and magical herbs. The practice of jumping over bonfires, rolling burning wheels down hillsides, and conducting other fire-related activities created spectacular community celebrations while symbolically participating in solar power and ensuring its continued strength throughout the growing season. Autumn harvest festivals combine thanksgiving for successful crops with preparation for winter survival, featuring elaborate feasting, the consecration of stored foods, and rituals designed to ensure adequate provisions throughout the harsh winter months. Archaeological evidence of harvest celebrations appears in large storage facilities, communal cooking areas, and ritual deposits of grain and other agricultural products that were offered to ensure continued divine favour. The practice of creating anthropomorphic figures from grain stalks, documented in ethnographic sources and supported by archaeological discoveries of woven organic materials in ritual contexts, demonstrates beliefs about harvest spirits that required propitiation and proper treatment to maintain their beneficial influence. Winter solstice observances focused on supporting the sun during its weakest period, while celebrating the gradual return of daylight that would eventually lead to spring renewal. Archaeological evidence of winter festivals includes specialised indoor gathering spaces, deposits of evergreen branches and other winter plants, and evidence of extended feasting activities that helped communities maintain morale during the darkest period of the year. The practice of maintaining large fires throughout the longest nights, bringing evergreen branches into domestic spaces, and conducting divination activities to predict the coming year's prospects created winter celebrations that combined practical survival strategies with religious observances designed to ensure cosmic renewal. Baltic resistance to Christianization proved remarkably persistent compared to other European regions, with pagan traditions maintaining their vitality well into the medieval period, despite sustained conversion efforts by neighbouring Christian powers. The geographical isolation of Baltic territories in dense forests and extensive wetlands provided natural protection against military conquest, while the decentralised nature of Baltic political organisation made systematic conversion efforts difficult to implement effectively. Archaeological evidence of this resistance appears in the continued use of traditional burial practices, the maintenance of cult sites, and the production of pagan religious objects throughout periods when Christian influence was officially dominant. The preservation of pagan traditions during the conversion period required sophisticated strategies for concealing religious activities from Christian authorities, while maintaining the essential ritual practices necessary for community survival and spiritual welfare. Archaeological evidence of clandestine pagan practice appears in household shrines hidden within domestic buildings, ritual objects disguised as ordinary tools or ornaments, and cult sites located in remote areas where Christian supervision was minimal or absent. The adaptation of traditional religious practices to changed political circumstances demonstrates the flexibility and resilience of Baltic religious traditions, while highlighting their fundamental importance to community identity and cultural continuity. The integration of Christian and pagan elements created syncretic religious systems that preserved essential Baltic theological concepts while satisfying the requirements of official Christian observance. Archaeological evidence of religious syncretism appears in Christian symbols incorporated into traditional craft designs, church buildings constructed on former pagan cult sites, and burial practices that combine Christian and pagan elements in ways that suggest ongoing belief in traditional supernatural powers despite official conversion. The persistence of pre-Christian seasonal festivals within Christian calendrical frameworks allowed Baltic communities to maintain crucial agricultural and social rituals while avoiding direct confrontation with Christian religious authorities. The role of women in preserving pagan traditions proved particularly important during the conversion period, with female religious specialists maintaining traditional healing practices, seasonal ceremonies, and household rituals that ensured cultural continuity despite official religious changes. Archaeological evidence of women's religious activities appears in specialized burial goods, household shrine materials, and craft objects that demonstrate the continuation of traditional female religious roles throughout the conversion period. The domestic nature of much women's religious practice provided natural concealment from Christian authorities while ensuring that essential cultural knowledge could be transmitted to future generations through family networks and informal educational systems. The religious geography of ancient Europe emerged from the profound understanding that supernatural forces inhabited specific locations where the boundary between mortal and divine realms became permeable, creating sacred landscapes that shaped both settlement patterns and spiritual practices across diverse pagan traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Externstein in Germany reveals how natural rock formations served as focal points for religious activities spanning millennia, with carved reliefs, artificial caves, and astronomical alignments demonstrating the sophisticated ways European pagans transformed natural features into complex ceremonial centres. The towering sandstone pillars at Externstein contain Christian reliefs carved over earlier pagan symbols, indicating the site's continuous sacred significance from prehistoric times through the medieval period, while nearby archaeological deposits reveal ritual activities including weapon offerings, cremated remains, and votive objects spanning the Bronze Age through the early medieval period. Mountain peaks held particular significance across European pagan traditions as places where earth met sky, creating natural temples where divine powers could be approached more directly than in ordinary terrestrial locations. The Puy de Dôme in central France exemplifies this sacred mountain tradition, with archaeological excavations revealing a massive Gallo-Roman temple complex built atop earlier Celtic cult sites that had attracted pilgrims and ritual activities for centuries before Roman conquest. The temple's foundations reveal sophisticated engineering designed to create level ceremonial spaces on the mountain's summit, while votive deposits discovered throughout the site include thousands of bronze figurines, coins, and personal ornaments offered by visitors seeking divine favour, healing, or prophetic guidance from the mountain's resident deities. Sacred springs and wells formed another crucial category of natural religious sites, with their life-giving waters understood as manifestations of divine power and their depths serving as gateways to otherworld realms inhabited by supernatural beings. The spring sanctuary at Chamalières near Clermont-Ferrand in France contained over 10,000 wooden votive offerings preserved in the waterlogged environment, including carved human figures, animal representations, and tablets inscribed with prayers and requests in the Gaulish language. These wooden offerings, dating from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, demonstrate the continuity of Celtic religious practices during the Roman period, while revealing the sophisticated artistic traditions that developed around water worship throughout Gaul. The thermal springs at Aquae Sulis in Britain represent one of the most elaborate examples of Romano-Celtic water worship, where the natural hot springs were enhanced with monumental architecture that combined Roman engineering with Celtic theological concepts. Archaeological excavations have revealed the sacred spring's original Celtic shrine, later incorporated into a massive Roman temple complex dedicated to Sulis Minerva. a syncretic deity combining the Celtic goddess Sulis with Roman Minerva. The spring's constant temperature of 46 degrees Celsius and its mineral-rich waters attracted visitors from across Roman Britain, who deposited curse tablets, precious objects, and personal items in the sacred pool while seeking healing, justice, or divine intervention in personal affairs. Forest sanctuaries provided the most widespread form of natural sacred space across European pagan traditions, with dense woodlands offering both practical concealment for religious activities and symbolic representation of the untamed natural world, where supernatural forces maintained their strongest presence. The Teutoburg forest in Germany served as a major cult centre for Germanic tribes, with archaeological evidence revealing ritual deposits, weapon sacrifices, and evidence of large-scale gatherings that brought together multiple tribal groups for seasonal festivals and religious ceremonies. Roman sources describe the forest as containing sacred groves where human sacrifices were conducted and where Germanic priests maintained tribal religious traditions despite Roman military pressure and conversion efforts. Celtic Nemeton, or sacred groves, functioned as outdoor temples where druids conducted the most important religious ceremonies, including seasonal festivals, legal proceedings, and initiation rites that required the presence of divine powers inhabiting ancient trees. The sanctuary at Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France reveals the archaeological signature of these forest temples, with a rectangular enclosure containing a central pit where weapons, animal bones, and human remains were deposited over several centuries. The careful arrangement of these offerings, with iron weapons ritually bent before deposition and animal bones, sorted according to specific protocols, demonstrates the sophisticated ceremonial procedures that governed Celtic grove worship and the complex relationships between human communities and forest-dwelling deities. The construction of religious architecture within these sacred landscapes required careful attention to astronomical alignments, topographical features, and the existing spiritual geography that had developed through centuries of ritual activity. Stonehenge represents the most famous example of this architectural approach, with its massive trilithon circle precisely aligned to capture the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, while incorporating earlier monument phases that had marked the site's sacred significance for over 1,500 years. Recent archaeological research has revealed that Stonehenge's builders selected the location partly because of natural acoustic properties that amplified sound within the stone circle, creating an environment where ritual music, chanting, and spoken ceremonies would have achieved enhanced auditory effects that reinforced the site's supernatural atmosphere. The Gusseck Circle in Germany, dating to approximately 4900 BC, demonstrates the early development of astronomical architecture among European Neolithic populations, with its wooden palisade containing precisely positioned openings that frame the winter solstice sunrise and sunset. Archaeological excavations within the circle have revealed evidence of fire ceremonies, ritual feasting, and human sacrifice, suggesting that the astronomical alignment served practical ceremonial purposes rather than purely observational functions. The site's careful orientation towards solar phenomena indicates sophisticated mathematical knowledge and multi-generational observation projects that required coordinated community effort and specialised astronomical expertise. Megalithic tomb construction across Atlantic Europe created monumental religious architecture that combined burial functions with astronomical observation and community gathering spaces for seasonal ceremonies. The Passage Tomb at Newgrange in Ireland exemplifies this architectural tradition, with its 19-metre-long passage precisely aligned to admit the winter solstice sunrise into the central chamber for exactly 17 minutes each year. The tomb's construction required an estimated 200,000 tons of stone transported from quarries up to 80 kilometres away, while its elaborate carved decorations include spiral motifs, diamond patterns and other symbols that likely held specific religious significance for the Neolithic builders. The Carnac alignments in Brittany represent perhaps the most extensive example of megalithic religious architecture, with over 3,000 standing stones arranged in parallel rows extending for several kilometres across the landscape. Archaeological research has revealed that these alignments were constructed in multiple phases between 4,500 and 3,300 BC, with different sections oriented toward various astronomical phenomena, including lunar cycles, seasonal solar positions, and stellar observations. The stone's arrangement creates complex geometric patterns that may have served as calculation devices for predicting eclipses, determining festival dates, and coordinating agricultural activities with celestial cycles. Germanic and Scandinavian religious architecture emphasized wooden construction techniques that reflected both practical building traditions and theological concepts about the sacred nature of trees and forest materials. The temple at Uppsala, described in medieval sources as containing images of Odin, Thor and Freya surrounded by a sacred grove, represents the culmination of Germanic wooden temple traditions that developed from earlier hall-based religious practices. Archaeological excavations at similar sites like Tissø in Denmark have revealed the foundations of large wooden halls that combined residential, administrative, and religious functions, with ritual deposits and specialized architectural features indicating their use for seasonal festivals and religious ceremonies. The stave church tradition that emerged in Scandinavia during the Christian conversion period preserved many architectural elements from earlier pagan temple construction, including elaborate wooden carvings, dragon head decorations, and construction techniques that emphasized vertical timber frameworks. Archaeological analysis of early stave churches reveals the reuse of materials from pagan temples, suggesting deliberate attempts to transfer sacred power from older religious sites to new Christian buildings. The preservation of pagan decorative motifs in Christian architecture demonstrates the persistence of earlier artistic traditions and the complex cultural negotiations that characterized religious conversion processes throughout Scandinavia. Slavic wooden temple architecture reached its most sophisticated expression in the multi-story structures described at sites like Arkona on Rügen Island, where medieval chronicles describe a massive wooden temple containing a four-faced idol of Svantevit, surrounded by elaborate decorations and ritual implements. Archaeological excavations have revealed the temple's stone foundations, along with evidence of the wooden superstructure that housed one of the most important cult centres in the Western Slavic world. The temple's strategic coastal location and its elaborate architectural features served both religious and political functions, symbolizing Slavic resistance to Christian conversion while providing a focal point for tribal identity and religious authority. The construction of religious architecture often required specialized craftsmen who possessed both technical building skills and religious knowledge, necessary for creating structures capable of housing divine presence and facilitating supernatural communication. Archaeological evidence of these religious builders appears in the form of specialized tools, distinctive construction techniques, and workshop areas associated with major cult sites where architectural projects were planned and executed. The integration of practical construction knowledge with theological understanding created a class of religious architects whose expertise was essential for maintaining proper relationships between human communities and the supernatural powers that inhabited sacred buildings. Burial mound construction represented one of the most widespread forms of religious architecture across European pagan traditions, with these earthen monuments serving multiple functions as burial sites, territorial markers, and focal points for ancestor worship activities. The Sutton Hoo ship burial in England exemplifies the sophisticated engineering and religious symbolism that characterized elite burial mound construction. with its 27-metre-long ship placed within a carefully excavated chamber and covered with a mound that would have dominated the surrounding landscape for centuries. The burial's elaborate grave goods, including weapons, jewellery and ceremonial objects, demonstrate the integration of political authority with religious symbolism that characterised Germanic royal burial practices. Scandinavian ship burials, like those discovered at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, reveal the complex religious concepts underlying these monumental burial practices, with complete vessels serving as transportation for the deceased's journey to otherworld realms, while their rich grave goods provided the material necessities for afterlife existence. The Oseberg ship burial contained not only the vessel itself, but also sleds, wagons, textile implements, and carved wooden objects that suggest beliefs about continued activity and social status in the afterlife. The careful arrangement of these grave goods, according to specific protocols, demonstrates the sophisticated ritual knowledge required for conducting royal burial ceremonies. The practice of cremation within burial mounds created different but equally complex religious architecture, with elaborate pyre constructions designed to ensure complete consumption of both body and grave goods, while creating spectacular visual displays that reinforced beliefs about the deceased's transformation and spiritual journey. Archaeological excavations of cremation mounds reveal the careful engineering required for successful pyre construction, including drainage systems, air circulation features, and fuel arrangements that would generate the intense heat necessary for complete cremation. The Spong Hill Cemetery in Norfolk contains over 2,400 cremation urns, arranged in family groups and territorial clusters that demonstrate the social organisation underlying Anglo-Saxon burial practices. Stone circles and wooden henges created enclosed sacred spaces where communities could gather for religious ceremonies, while maintaining separation from the ordinary profane world that surrounded these ritual venues. The Avebury complex in Wiltshire encompasses multiple stone circles, avenues, and associated monuments within a landscape that was continuously modified and enhanced over more than 1,000 years of religious use. Archaeological research has revealed the complex construction sequence that created this sacred landscape, with different monument phases reflecting changing religious practices and evolving theological concepts, while maintaining the site's fundamental character as a gathering place for large-scale ceremonial activities. The integration of burial monuments into broader sacred landscapes created pilgrimage routes and ceremonial pathways that connected different religious sites, while establishing territorial claims and tribal boundaries marked by ancestral presence. The Ridgeway in southern England follows a prehistoric route that connects numerous burial mounds, stone circles and hill forts, creating a sacred geography that guided both religious and secular movement across the landscape. Archaeological evidence along these ancient routes includes ritual deposits, waymarker stones, and evidence of temporary camps that suggest regular use by pilgrims and travellers seeking access to the various cult sites that mark significant points along the journey. The cursus monuments found throughout Britain represent another form of religious architecture designed to create ceremonial pathways for processions, races, or other ritual activities that required linear movement across the landscape. The Greater Cursus near Stonehenge extends for nearly 3 kilometres and required the construction of parallel earthen banks and ditches that would have channeled movement while creating visual barriers that separated ceremonial activities from ordinary landscape use. Archaeological excavations within cursus monuments have revealed evidence of feasting, cremation activities, and ritual deposits that suggest their use for seasonal festivals and community gatherings that required large open spaces for accommodation and ceremonial activities. Baltic sacred architecture emphasised the integration of natural and constructed elements, with wooden temples built within sacred groves where eternal flames were maintained under divine protection. The temple complex at Remuva in Prussia, described in medieval chronicles as containing multiple buildings arranged around central fire altars, represents the sophisticated religious architecture that developed in Baltic territories despite their relative isolation from other European cultural centres. Archaeological evidence from similar sites reveals the careful spatial organisation required for these temple complexes, with separate buildings for different religious functions, living quarters for priests and priestesses, and storage facilities for the ritual implements and offerings that supported ongoing ceremonial activities. The maintenance of eternal flames required specialised architectural features, including fire-resistant construction materials, ventilation systems, and fuel storage facilities that could support continuous burning throughout all weather conditions and seasonal changes. Archaeological excavations at Baltic cult sites have revealed stone-lined fire pits, ceramic chimney systems, and evidence of the massive wood consumption required for maintaining perpetual fires. The integration of fire maintenance with other religious activities created complex architectural requirements that influenced the design and construction of entire temple complexes, while ensuring that sacred flames remained the focal point of religious observance. The network of sacred sites that developed across European pagan territories created interconnected religious landscapes where pilgrims could travel between different cult centres while participating in regional festival cycles and seasonal celebrations. The Via Francigena pilgrimage route, though later associated with Christian pilgrimage, follows pathways that connected pre-Christian sacred sites across Western Europe, suggesting the antiquity of long-distance religious travel and the economic and cultural networks that supported these spiritual journeys. Archaeological evidence of ancient pilgrimage includes distinctive pottery styles, exotic grave goods, and architectural features that suggest regular contact between distant religious communities despite the geographical barriers that separated different tribal territories. The preservation and transmission of architectural knowledge required specialised educational systems that trained craftsmen in both practical construction techniques and the religious principles that governed sacred building projects. Archaeological evidence of these educational traditions appears in the standardisation of construction techniques across vast geographical distances, the persistence of specific architectural forms over long periods, and the integration of local materials with traditional design principles that maintained religious effectiveness while adapting to local environmental conditions. The continuity of sacred architectural traditions throughout periods of political change and cultural disruption demonstrates the crucial role of religious buildings in maintaining community identity and spiritual continuity across generations of European pagan practitioners. The agricultural festivals that governed European pagan religious calendars emerged from intimate knowledge of seasonal cycles, soil conditions, and the complex relationships between human labour and supernatural forces that determined crop success or failure. Archaeological evidence from farming settlements across Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, and Baltic territories reveals sophisticated ritual systems that coordinated planting activities with astronomical observations, weather patterns, and the perceived moods of fertility deities whose favour required careful cultivation through specific ceremonial practices. Excavations at the Heuneberg Hill Fort in Germany have uncovered granary complexes containing ritual deposits of grain mixed with miniature agricultural tools, suggesting that stored seeds received supernatural blessing before spring planting through ceremonies that combined practical storage techniques with religious observances designed to ensure divine cooperation in farming endeavours. The timing of planting festivals required precise astronomical knowledge that coordinated human agricultural activities with celestial cycles, understood as manifestations of divine will and cosmic order. Celtic communities celebrated Imbolc around February 1st, marking the midpoint between winter solstice and spring equinox, when sheep began lactating and the first stirrings of agricultural renewal became visible in lengthening daylight and subtle changes in soil temperature. Archaeological evidence from Irish cult sites reveals increased ritual activity during early February, with deposits of dairy products, textile implements, and silver ornaments found in wells and springs associated with Brigid worship. The goddess's role as patroness of smithcraft, poetry and healing made her particularly important during this transitional period when communities prepared for the intensive agricultural work that would begin with spring ploughing. Germanic spring festivals emphasized the awakening of Earth's fertility through elaborate ceremonies that combined practical, agricultural preparation with religious observances designed to ensure divine favor for the coming growing season. The goddess Nerthus, described by Tacitus as traveling through tribal territories in a sacred wagon during spring festivals, embodied the Earth's returning fertility and required ritual bathing in sacred lakes after her ceremonial journey. Archaeological discoveries of ritual wagons in Danish bog deposits, including the elaborate vehicle found at Dybjerg, support literary accounts of these mobile religious ceremonies while demonstrating the sophisticated craftsmanship invested in objects designed for divine use. The practice of washing ritual implements and sacred objects in springs and lakes created annual purification cycles that removed the spiritual pollution accumulated during winter months while preparing religious equipment for renewed seasonal use. Slavic agricultural festivals demonstrated sophisticated understanding of soil ecology and plant biology through ritual practices that coordinated supernatural intervention with practical farming techniques designed to maximize crop yields in the challenging environmental conditions of Eastern European forests and steppes. The spring celebration of Jorilo honored a young god associated with vegetation growth, fertility, and the vital force that animated plant life during the growing season. Archaeological evidence of Jorilo worship appears in phallic symbols buried in fields, ritual deposits of grain and agricultural tools, and evidence of large-scale community gatherings at cult sites where seasonal festivals combined religious observances with practical activities like seed selection, tool maintenance, and the coordination of communal labour projects. Baltic spring rituals emphasized the crucial role of Zemina, the earth goddess whose cooperation was essential for successful agriculture in the region's sandy soils and short growing seasons. Communities conducted elaborate ploughing ceremonies where the first furrows of spring were blessed through offerings of bread, beer, and silver ornaments deposited in the newly turned earth. Archaeological excavations at Baltic agricultural sites reveal ritual deposits containing miniature ploughs, ceramic vessels shaped like farming tools, and arrangements of stones that marked the boundaries of fields where specific religious protocols governed planting activities. The integration of practical agricultural knowledge with supernatural intervention created farming systems that maximize both crop productivity and divine favor through careful attention to ritual requirements that accompanied all phases of agricultural work. Harvest festivals across European pagan traditions combined thanksgiving for successful crops with elaborate preparations for winter survival, featuring community gatherings that reinforce social bonds while acknowledging divine generosity and ensuring continued supernatural favour for future agricultural cycles. Celtic Lugnasad, celebrated in early August, honoured the god Lugh while marking the beginning of grain harvest and the first fruits of the agricultural year. Archaeological evidence from assembly sites like Tara in Ireland reveals extensive temporary structures, cooking facilities, and craft workshops that accommodated thousands of participants during these annual gatherings. The competitive aspects of Lugnasad included athletic contests, craft demonstrations, and poetic competitions that displayed individual skills, while reinforcing community hierarchies and providing opportunities for marriage negotiations and political alliances between different tribal groups. Germanic harvest celebrations emphasized the role of Freya and Freyja, fertility deities whose continued favour ensured agricultural abundance and livestock prosperity throughout the productive season. The practice of creating grain dollies and anthropomorphic harvest figures reflected beliefs about vegetation spirits that required proper treatment to ensure their beneficial influence continued into the following year. Archaeological discoveries of woven organic materials, carved wooden figures, and ceramic objects designed to represent supernatural beings provide evidence of these ritual practices while demonstrating the artistic sophistication that characterized Germanic religious craft traditions. The careful preservation of harvest figures throughout winter months, followed by their ritual destruction during spring planting ceremonies, created annual cycles that symbolically participated in natural processes of death and renewal that governed both agricultural and cosmic order. Slavic harvest festivals featured elaborate ceremonies honouring both Perun, whose control over weather had ensured adequate rainfall, and Veles, whose governance of Earth's fertility had produced successful crops. Communities constructed massive straw figures representing these deities, which were paraded through villages before being burned in bonfires that celebrated divine generosity, while symbolically releasing the supernatural forces that had been concentrated in agricultural product throughout the growing season. Archaeological evidence of these celebrations appears in large fire pits containing burned organic materials, cooking areas capable of preparing food for entire communities, and ritual deposits of grain, tools, and personal ornaments that mark the locations where harvest festivals were conducted. Baltic harvest traditions emphasized the crucial role of proper thanksgiving in maintaining relationships with supernatural powers that controlled agricultural success, with elaborate ceremonies designed to acknowledge divine generosity while ensuring continued favor for future farming seasons. The practice of offering first fruits to Zemina before consuming new crops created ritual protocols that governed the transition from agricultural work to harvest consumption. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized storage facilities where portions of each crop were set aside for divine offerings, ceramic vessels designed for ritual food preparation, and arrangements of agricultural tools that marked sacred spaces where harvest ceremonies were conducted. Livestock festivals formed another crucial component of European pagan agricultural celebrations, with ceremonies designed to ensure animal fertility, protect herds from disease and predators, and acknowledge the supernatural powers that governed pastoral prosperity. Celtic Beltane, celebrated around May 1st, featured elaborate fire ceremonies where cattle were driven between twin bonfires in rituals that combined practical veterinary care with spiritual protection. Archaeological evidence of Beltane celebrations includes paired fire pits, large quantities of cattle bones showing evidence of ritual slaughter and consumption, and deposits of iron tools and ornaments that suggest community-wide participation in these pastoral festivals. Germanic animal blessing ceremonies emphasized the role of Freya, whose sacred boar symbolized fertility and abundance, and whose favour was essential for successful breeding and healthy livestock. The practice of consecrating breeding animals through ritual bathing, the application of sacred oils, and the decoration of animals with blessed ornaments created religious protocols that integrated supernatural protection with practical animal husbandry techniques. Archaeological discoveries of specialized animal grooming tools, decorative harness fittings, and evidence of ritual animal slaughter provide material evidence of these religious practices while demonstrating the economic importance of livestock in Germanic agricultural systems. Slavic livestock festivals honoured Veles in his role as protector of cattle and domestic animals, with ceremonies that emphasized the god's control over animal fertility and his protection against supernatural threats that could devastate herds through disease or predation. Communities conducted ritual cattle counts, where each animal was blessed individually, while offerings of grain, dairy products, and valuable objects were deposited at springs and sacred groves associated with Veles worship. Archaeological evidence includes specialized cattle counting tokens, ritual deposits containing cattle bones and dairy vessels, and evidence of large-scale animal sacrifices that accompanied major pastoral festivals. Baltic animal ceremonies emphasized the integration of livestock management with broader agricultural and religious systems that governed all aspects of community survival and prosperity. The practice of maintaining sacred animals dedicated to specific deities created ongoing relationships between communities and their supernatural protectors, while providing focal points for seasonal festivals and ritual activities. Archaeological evidence of sacred animal keeping appears in specialized animal housing, elaborate feeding equipment, and burial sites where ritually significant animals receive treatment similar to human interments, complete with grave goods and ceremonial preparation. Life cycle rituals across European pagan traditions marked crucial transitions in individual development, while integrating personal milestones into broader community religious observances that reinforce social bonds and cultural values. Birth ceremonies required elaborate ritual preparations designed to ensure successful delivery, protect mothers and infants from supernatural threats, and integrate newborn children into the spiritual and social networks that would govern their future development. Celtic birth rituals emphasize the role of Brigid as protector of mothers and infants, with ceremonies conducted at sacred wells and springs where the goddess's healing powers were most accessible. Germanic birth traditions involved the consultation of Norns, supernatural beings who determined individual fate at the moment of birth, with ritual practices designed to influence these divine decisions and ensure favourable destinies for newborn children. Archaeological evidence of birth rituals appears in specialised birthing chambers within domestic buildings, arrangements of protective amulets and ritual objects, and deposits of placental remains and umbilical cords at sacred sites that created ongoing connections between children and the supernatural powers that had overseen their birth. Slavic birth ceremonies emphasized the role of ancestral spirits and household deities in protecting vulnerable infants during their first months of life, with elaborate naming ceremonies that formally introduced children to their spiritual guardians and community protectors. The practice of depositing birth-related materials at household shrines, sacred springs, and ancestral burial sites created networks of supernatural protection that surrounded children with multiple layers of divine favour and community support. Baltic birth traditions involved complex negotiations with Laima, the fate goddess whose decisions at birth determined individual destinies and future prospects. Ritual preparations for birth included the purification of domestic spaces, the preparation of appropriate offerings, and the performance of ceremonies designed to ensure divine favour during labour and delivery. Archaeological evidence of birth rituals includes specialised ceramic vessels, silver amulets depicting protective symbols, and arrangements of stones and other objects that created sacred spaces within domestic buildings where births could occur under divine protection. Coming-of-age ceremonies marked the crucial transition from childhood to adult status, while providing opportunities for young people to demonstrate their readiness for full participation in community, religious and social life. Celtic initiation rites often involved periods of isolation in sacred groves or wilderness areas, where young people underwent spiritual trials designed to test their courage, wisdom and commitment to tribal values. Archaeological evidence of these practices appears in remote cult sites containing evidence of temporary occupation, ritual deposits of personal ornaments and weapons, and specialized structures that may have served as initiation venues. Germanic coming-of-age traditions emphasized martial training and the acquisition of adult weapons through ceremonies that combined practical, military instruction with religious observances designed to ensure divine favor in future combat. Young men received their first spears and shields in ritual contexts that connected them to ancestral warrior traditions, while invoking supernatural protection for their military careers. Archaeological evidence includes weapons deposits containing juvenile-sized equipment, specialized training areas within settlement complexes, and burial sites where young warriors were interred with adult military equipment that reflected their successful completion of initiation processes. Slavic initiation ceremonies involved both male and female participants in gender-specific rituals that prepared young people for their adult roles within community, social and economic systems. Male initiation emphasized hunting skills, agricultural knowledge, and the religious responsibilities associated with adult male status, while female ceremonies focused on textile production, household management, and the specialized knowledge required for women's religious roles. Archaeological evidence of these practices includes gender-specific tool deposits, specialized workshop areas within settlements, and evidence of age-graded participation in different types of ritual activities. Baltic coming-of-age traditions involved elaborate ceremonies conducted at sacred groves and springs, where young people demonstrated their knowledge of traditional customs, religious practices, and the specialized skills required for adult community membership. The integration of practical education with religious instruction created initiation systems that ensured cultural continuity while preparing young people for their future responsibilities as full community members. Marriage customs across European pagan traditions combined practical considerations of alliance formation, property transfer, and genetic diversity with religious observances that invoked divine blessing for successful unions and fertile offspring. Celtic marriage ceremonies often occurred during seasonal festivals when supernatural powers were most accessible, and when community gatherings provided opportunities for negotiating alliances between different tribal groups. Archaeological evidence of marriage rituals includes paired burial sites, matching sets of personal ornaments, and evidence of large-scale feasting activities that accompanied wedding celebrations. Germanic marriage traditions emphasized the role of Frigg and Freya as divine protectors of married women and household prosperity, with ceremonies that invoked these goddesses' favour for successful domestic management and fertile marriages. The practice of bride price payments and dowry arrangements created economic relationships between families, while ritual exchanges of weapons, jewellery and household goods established spiritual bonds that connected married couples to their ancestral traditions and community obligations. Slavic marriage customs involved elaborate negotiations with Mokosh, the goddess who governed women's work and household fertility, with ceremonies designed to ensure divine favour for successful domestic partnerships and productive households. Wedding rituals included the blessing of domestic implements, the consecration of household spaces, and the performance of ceremonies that formally integrated married couples into the spiritual and social networks that would support their future family life. Baltic marriage traditions emphasized the role of Lema in determining marital compatibility and ensuring successful unions through her control over individual destinies and relationship outcomes. Wedding ceremonies included divination activities designed to predict marital success, ritual preparations that invoked divine blessing for fertile marriages, and community celebrations that reinforced social bonds while acknowledging the supernatural powers that govern domestic prosperity. Funeral practices across European pagan traditions reflected sophisticated theological concepts about death, afterlife existence, and the continuing relationships between living communities and their deceased members. Celtic burial customs varied according to social status, regional traditions, and specific religious requirements, but consistently emphasized the provision of grave goods necessary for afterlife existence and the maintenance of ongoing connections between the dead and their surviving family members. Archaeological evidence from Celtic cemeteries reveals elaborate burial preparations, including specialized grave construction, careful arrangement of personal possessions, and evidence of post-burial ritual activities that maintained relationships with deceased community members. Germanic funeral traditions emphasized the dramatic transformation of death through cremation ceremonies, designed to release spiritual essence while destroying material constraints that bound souls to earthly existence. The construction of elaborate funeral pyres required specialized knowledge of fire management, fuel selection, and ritual protocols that ensured complete consumption of both body and grave goods. Archaeological excavations of cremation sites reveal the sophisticated engineering required for successful pyre construction, including drainage systems, air circulation features, and fuel arrangements that generated the intense heat necessary for complete cremation while creating spectacular visual displays that reinforced beliefs about spiritual transformation and otherworld journey. The institutional structures governing European pagan religious life emerged from complex social needs, requiring specialized knowledge keepers who could maintain proper relationships between human communities and supernatural powers while preserving the technical expertise necessary for conducting elaborate rituals across seasonal cycles. Archaeological evidence from cult sites across Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, and Baltic territories reveals the material signatures of priestly activities, including specialized religious implements, distinctive burial practices for religious officials, and architectural features designed to support the complex ceremonial requirements that characterized European pagan worship. Excavations at the Gaulish sanctuary of Ribemont-sur-Ancre have uncovered evidence of priestly quarters adjacent to ritual areas, containing collections of bronze ritual vessels, iron implements used for divination, and human remains showing evidence of trepanation and other medical procedures that suggest the integration of healing practices with religious authority. Druidic education systems represented the most sophisticated and well-documented priestly training programs in ancient Europe, requiring 20 years of intensive study that encompassed law, medicine, astronomy, genealogy, and the vast corpus of oral literature that preserved Celtic cultural and religious knowledge. Archaeological evidence of Druidic educational practices appears in the form of specialized writing tablets, bronze stelae used for temporary notation despite the prohibition against recording sacred knowledge permanently, and evidence of large gathering sites where students from across Celtic territories assembled for instruction. The sanctuary at Bibracte in Gaul contains evidence of educational facilities including lecture halls, student quarters, and library areas where written materials were consulted during the learning process, though the most crucial religious knowledge remained transmitted exclusively through oral tradition to maintain its sacred character and prevent unauthorized access to dangerous supernatural information. The hierarchical structure of Druidic orders included multiple grades of practitioners ranging from novice students through specialized experts in particular aspects of religious knowledge, to the archdruids who governed major cult centers and coordinated religious activities across tribal boundaries. Archaeological evidence of this institutional hierarchy appears in burial sites where different grades of druids receive distinctive treatment reflecting their religious rank and specialized knowledge. The Coligny calendar, a bronze tablet containing a complex lunisolar calendar system, demonstrates the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that Druids maintained for timing religious festivals and coordinating ceremonial activities across the Celtic world. While its technical complexity suggests that only the highest-ranking religious officials possessed the mathematical skills necessary for its proper interpretation and use. Druidic specialization included distinct categories of practitioners with different responsibilities and areas of expertise within the broader religious system. Bards maintained the oral traditions, including genealogies, heroic narratives, and the complex poetic forms that preserved historical and mythological knowledge across generations. Archaeological evidence of bardic activities appears in the form of musical instruments, including bronze horns, wooden harps, and specialized acoustic spaces within cult sites where performances could achieve maximum auditory effect. The integration of musical and poetic traditions with religious instruction created educational systems that use memory techniques, rhythmic patterns, and emotional engagement to ensure accurate transmission of cultural knowledge across centuries of oral tradition. Vates specialized in divination, prophecy, and the interpretation of supernatural signs that guided community decision-making and individual life choices. Their training included the observation of natural phenomena, the interpretation of animal behavior, and the complex ritual procedures required for conducting various forms of divination, including haruspicy, augury, and the casting of lots. Archaeological evidence of divinatory practices appears in specialized ritual implements including bronze mirrors used for scrying, collections of marked stones or wooden pieces used for sortilege, and evidence of animal sacrifice areas where internal organs were examined for prophetic signs. The Gundestrup cauldron depicts scenes that may represent divinatory rituals, including figures examining what appear to be sacrificial victims while surrounded by supernatural beings and symbolic animals. The medical aspects of Druidic practice integrated supernatural healing with sophisticated knowledge of herbal medicine, surgical procedures, and the treatment of both physical ailments and spiritual disorders that required religious intervention. Archaeological excavations at healing sanctuaries like Fontes Sequanae in Gaul have revealed thousands of wooden and stone anatomical votives representing body parts requiring divine intervention, along with evidence of medical facilities including surgical instruments, medicinal preparation areas, and specialized bathing pools designed for therapeutic treatment. The combination of religious and medical authority in Druidic practitioners created healing systems that addressed both supernatural causes of illness and practical medical treatment through an integrated approach that recognized the interconnection between spiritual and physical health. Germanic Godar represented a different model of religious authority that combined priestly functions with political leadership and legal responsibility within tribal social structures. Unlike the professional priesthood characteristic of Celtic Druidism, Godar typically inherited their positions through family lineage or achieved them through demonstration of religious knowledge, political acumen, and the personal charisma necessary for effective community leadership. Archaeological evidence of Godar activities appears in the form of elaborate hall complexes that integrated religious and secular functions, specialized religious equipment found in high-status burials, and evidence of the large-scale feasting and gift-giving activities that maintained their political authority while fulfilling their religious obligations to ensure divine favor for their communities. The religious responsibilities of Germanic Godar included the conduct of seasonal festivals, the maintenance of proper relationships with supernatural powers, and the provision of religious guidance for community members facing important decisions or spiritual crises. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tiso in Denmark reveal the material infrastructure required for these religious activities, including large halls capable of accommodating hundreds of participants during seasonal gatherings, specialized cooking facilities for preparing ritual feasts, and storage areas for the valuable objects that God had distributed as gifts to maintain their political alliances and religious authority. The integration of religious and political functions created leadership systems where spiritual effectiveness directly influenced secular power, providing strong incentives for Godar to maintain orthodox religious practices and ensure divine favor for their territories. Germanic religious specialists included various categories of practitioners with different areas of expertise within the broader framework of religious knowledge and supernatural practice. Cedar practitioners possessed specialized knowledge of trance techniques, spirit communication, and magical operations that allowed them to manipulate supernatural forces for healing, divination, and the alteration of physical reality. Archaeological evidence of cider practice appears in the form of iron staffs topped with ornamental heads that served as focusing implements for magical operations, ritual platforms where practitioners conducted their ceremonies, and evidence of the musical accompaniment and ritual support that facilitated trance states and supernatural communication. The practice of cedar involved specific gender associations and social implications that reflected Germanic understanding of different types of supernatural power and their appropriate practitioners. Female cedar workers, known as vulvas, held particularly important positions as travelling prophets and healers, whose services were sought by kings and chieftains requiring guidance on important political and military decisions. Archaeological evidence of vulvar activities appears in distinctive burial assemblages including iron staffs, unusual textile fragments, and collections of amulets and magical implements that distinguish these practitioners from ordinary female burials while reflecting their high social status and specialized religious authority. Male practitioners of Seder face different social expectations and potential criticism due to Germanic cultural concepts about appropriate masculine behavior and the perceived feminizing effects of certain types of magical practice. The tension between the practical value of Seder abilities and cultural concerns about gender-appropriate behavior created complex social dynamics that influenced how male magical practitioners operated within Germanic society. Archaeological evidence suggests that male Seder workers often combined their magical abilities with other forms of religious or political authority that provided alternative sources of social legitimacy and community respect. Runic specialists represented another category of Germanic religious practitioners whose expertise in the magical applications of writing provided essential services for both individual clients and community religious activities. The mastery of runic writing required extensive training in the symbolic meanings of individual runes, the proper combinations for creating effective magical formulas, and the ritual procedures necessary for activating runic magic through appropriate ceremonial contexts. Archaeological evidence of runic practice appears in inscribed weapons, jewellery, memorial stones, and wooden objects that demonstrate the widespread use of runic writing for both mundane record-keeping and supernatural purposes. The educational systems that transmitted runic knowledge included both formal instruction and apprenticeship relationships that ensured accurate preservation of runic meanings and magical applications across generations of practitioners. Archaeological discoveries of runic practice materials include sets of marked stones or wooden pieces used for divination, stylus tools for carving runic inscriptions, and evidence of workshop areas where runic objects were produced and consecrated through appropriate ritual procedures. The standardization of runic forms across vast geographical distances demonstrates the existence of coordinated educational networks that maintained consistency in both writing practices and magical applications despite the political fragmentation characteristic of Germanic tribal society. Slavic religious hierarchy centered around the institution of Volkvi, priestly specialists who combined religious authority with political influence and specialized knowledge of agricultural cycles, healing practices, and the complex ritual requirements necessary for maintaining proper relationships with the diverse supernatural powers that governed Slavic spiritual life. Archaeological evidence of Volkvi activities appears in elaborate cult complexes like those discovered at Perin near Novgorod, where circular temple arrangements surrounded by sacred groves provided venues for the large-scale ceremonial activities that required specialized religious coordination and community organization. The training of Slavic Volkvi involved extensive apprenticeship periods during which candidates learned the complex ritual procedures, astronomical knowledge, and therapeutic techniques that characterized professional religious practice. Archaeological evidence suggests that Volkvi education included both practical instruction in specific technical skills and theoretical understanding of cosmological concepts that governed the timing and conduct of religious ceremonies. Excavations at cult sites reveal evidence of educational facilities including specialized workshops where ritual implements were produced, library areas where written materials were consulted despite the primarily oral nature of Slavic religious tradition, and residential quarters where students lived during their training periods. Slavic religious specialization included various categories of practitioners with different areas of expertise and social responsibilities within the broader framework of community spiritual life. Healing specialists possessed detailed knowledge of herbal medicine, surgical procedures, and the ritual techniques necessary for treating both physical ailments and supernatural afflictions that required religious intervention. Archaeological evidence of Slavic healing practices appears in the form of medical instruments, collections of medicinal plants preserved in waterlogged deposits, and specialized buildings within cult complexes that served as treatment centers for pilgrims and community members seeking divine healing. Divination specialists among Slavic religious practitioners maintained expertise in various forms of prophetic technique, including the interpretation of natural phenomena, the observation of animal behaviour, and the complex ritual procedures required for conducting sortilege and other forms of supernatural consultation. Archaeological evidence of Slavic divination includes collections of marked objects used for casting lots, specialized ritual vessels designed for conducting water divination, and evidence of animal sacrifice areas where internal organs were examined for prophetic significance. The integration of divinatory practices with agricultural decision-making created religious systems that provided practical guidance for farming communities, while maintaining proper relationships with supernatural powers that controlled crop success and livestock prosperity. Baltic religious institutions centered around the maintenance of eternal flames that required specialized priestesses who dedicated their lives to ensuring these sacred fires never extinguished while conducting the complex ceremonial activities that surrounded fire worship throughout Baltic territories. The Vedaluts who tended these flames underwent rigorous selection processes and extensive training that prepared them for their crucial religious responsibilities. Archaeological evidence of their activities appears in the form of specialized fire maintenance tools, ceramic vessels designed for ritual use, and residential quarters within temple complexes that house the priestesses and their assistants throughout their terms of religious service. The educational systems that prepared Baltic priestesses for their religious duties included both practical instruction in fire maintenance techniques and theoretical understanding of the theological concepts that governed fire worship and its relationship to broader cosmic processes. Archaeological excavations at Baltic cult sites reveal evidence of educational facilities including specialized workshops where ritual implements were produced, study areas where astronomical observations were conducted, and ceremonial spaces where initiation rites were performed to formally induct new priestesses into their religious roles. Baltic religious hierarchy included various grades of practitioners with different levels of responsibility and authority within the institutional structures that governed fire worship and seasonal festivals. Senior priestesses possessed ultimate authority over temple operations and the conduct of major religious ceremonies, while junior practitioners handled routine maintenance activities and assisted with the complex logistical requirements of large-scale festivals. Archaeological evidence of this hierarchical organization appears in differential burial treatment for religious officials of different ranks, specialized religious equipment that reflects varying levels of authority and responsibility, and architectural features within temple complexes that provided appropriate spaces for different categories of religious personnel. The integration of astronomical knowledge with religious practice required specialized education that prepared Baltic religious officials to coordinate ceremonial activities with celestial phenomena and seasonal transitions. Archaeological evidence of astronomical observation includes stone circles and wooden posts that align with significant celestial events, collections of marked objects that served as calculation devices for predicting eclipses and determining festival dates, and evidence of the mathematical knowledge necessary for maintaining accurate calendrical systems that govern the timing of religious observances throughout the year. Magical practices across European pagan traditions encompassed various techniques for manipulating supernatural forces, communicating with otherworld beings, and altering physical reality through the application of specialized knowledge and ritual procedures. The distinction between religious ceremony and magical operation often remained fluid, with many practices serving both devotional and practical functions while requiring similar types of specialized training and institutional support. Archaeological evidence of magical practice appears in the form of specialized implements, ritual spaces designed for magical operations, and deposits of materials used in various forms of supernatural manipulation. Healing magic represented one of the most widespread and socially important forms of magical practice, combining supernatural intervention with practical medical knowledge to treat ailments that required both physical and spiritual treatment. Archaeological evidence of healing magic appears in collections of medicinal plants, surgical instruments that show evidence of ritual consecration, and specialized healing sanctuaries where patients received both medical treatment and religious intervention. The integration of magical and medical practice created healing systems that addressed multiple potential causes of illness, while providing comprehensive treatment approaches that recognized the interconnection between spiritual and physical health. Protective magic involved various techniques for creating supernatural barriers against hostile forces, ensuring personal safety during dangerous activities, and maintaining spiritual defenses for both individuals and communities. Archaeological evidence of protective magic includes amulets and talismans designed to provide supernatural protection, ritual deposits that created protective boundaries around settlements and territories, and evidence of the ceremonial procedures used to consecrate protective objects and activate their supernatural properties. The widespread use of protective magic reflects the perceived prevalence of supernatural threats and the importance of maintaining adequate spiritual defenses against hostile magical operations. Divination magic encompassed various techniques for obtaining supernatural knowledge about future events, hidden information, and the proper courses of action for addressing specific problems or opportunities. Archaeological evidence of divinatory magic includes specialized implements used for various forms of supernatural consultation, ritual spaces designed for conducting divination ceremonies, and deposits of materials used in different types of prophetic practice. The integration of divination with political decision-making, military planning, and agricultural management created magical systems that provided practical guidance while maintaining proper relationships with supernatural powers that controlled important aspects of community life. Weather magic involved techniques for influencing atmospheric conditions, ensuring adequate rainfall for agricultural purposes, and protecting communities from destructive storms and other meteorological threats. Archaeological evidence of weather magic includes ritual deposits made during specific atmospheric conditions, specialized implements used for conducting weather ceremonies, and evidence of the astronomical knowledge necessary for timing weather magic to coincide with natural atmospheric patterns. The importance of weather magic in agricultural societies created strong incentives for developing and maintaining effective techniques for supernatural weather influence, while ensuring that such practices remained integrated with broader religious systems that governed community spiritual life. The transmission of magical knowledge required sophisticated educational systems that preserved technical information while ensuring that dangerous supernatural techniques remained under appropriate institutional control. Archaeological evidence of magical education includes specialized training facilities, collections of practice materials used during instruction, and evidence of the apprenticeship relationships that transmitted magical knowledge across generations of practitioners. The integration of magical education with broader religious training created educational systems that maintained both practical magical effectiveness and appropriate theological understanding of the supernatural forces that magical practitioners sought to manipulate through their specialized knowledge and ritual expertise. The Christianization of Europe unfolded as a complex process of negotiation, adaptation, and gradual transformation rather than the sudden replacement of pagan traditions with imported religious forms. Archaeological evidence from sites across medieval Europe reveals the sophisticated strategies employed by both Christian missionaries and pagan populations as they navigated the religious transitions that would fundamentally reshape European spiritual life, while preserving essential elements of pre-Christian tradition within new theological frameworks. Excavations at Canterbury Cathedral have uncovered a Romano-Celtic temple beneath a medieval church, with evidence of continued ritual activity during the early Christian period, including votive deposits that combine Christian symbols with traditional Celtic offerings, suggesting deliberate attempts to transfer sacred power from older religious sites to new Christian institutions, while maintaining continuity with established patterns of supernatural veneration. The gradual nature of Christianization emerges clearly from archaeological evidence showing the persistence of pagan burial practices, ritual deposits, and cult site usage throughout periods when Christian conversion was officially complete. At Sutton Hoo, the famous ship burial contains both pagan grave goods and Christian silver bowls, reflecting the complex religious identity of early medieval Anglo-Saxon elites who maintained traditional warrior burial customs while adopting Christian symbols and theological concepts. Similar evidence appears across Europe, where medieval cemeteries contain burials that combine Christian orientation and symbols with traditional grave goods, protective amulets, and ritual arrangements that suggest ongoing belief in pre-Christian concepts about death, afterlife, and the supernatural powers that governed individual fate and family prosperity. The absorption of pagan deities into Christian theological frameworks occurred through sophisticated processes of theological reinterpretation that preserved essential divine functions while redirecting supernatural authority toward Christian saints and biblical figures. Brigid's transformation from Celtic goddess to Irish saint exemplifies this process, with her feast day coinciding with Imbolc and her attributes as patroness of smithcraft, poetry and healing remaining essentially unchanged despite her integration into Christian hagiography. Archaeological evidence from Kildare reveals the continuity of fire worship at Brigid's shrine, where sacred flames were maintained by Christian nuns using identical techniques to those employed by earlier pagan priestesses. While the site's physical layout preserved the essential spatial arrangements that had characterized pre-Christian fire worship throughout Celtic territories, the theological mechanisms underlying divine transformation involved careful preservation of supernatural functions while redirecting religious authority toward figures acceptable within Christian cosmology. Thor's attributes as thunder god and giant slayer were transferred to Saint Michael the Archangel, whose iconography in Scandinavian churches frequently depicts him wielding hammer-like weapons while battling demonic forces that clearly derive from earlier representations of Jotuns and other chaotic supernatural beings. Archaeological evidence from medieval Scandinavian churches reveals the reuse of Thor's hammer pendants as Christian crosses, with identical metalworking techniques and decorative motifs, suggesting deliberate continuity in religious jewellery production while adapting traditional symbols to new theological requirements. The process of saint creation often involved the Christianization of local pagan deities whose cult sites became pilgrimage destinations under new religious management, while preserving essential ritual practices and supernatural functions. St. Walpurga's association with May Day celebrations and protection against witchcraft clearly derives from earlier Germanic fertility goddesses, while her feast day coincides with Beltane, and her protective functions mirror those of pre-Christian female deities who governed agricultural cycles and supernatural defence. Archaeological excavations at Walpurga's shrine at Eichstätt reveal the continuous use of the site for religious purposes spanning the pagan-Christian transition, with ritual deposits showing gradual changes in offering types while maintaining consistent spatial arrangements and ceremonial practices that preserved essential elements of earlier religious tradition. Regional variations in the Christianization process reflected local political circumstances, existing religious traditions, and the specific strategies employed by different missionary organizations as they encountered diverse pagan populations across Europe. In Ireland, the relatively peaceful conversion process allowed for extensive synthesis between Christian and Celtic traditions, creating distinctive forms of Celtic Christianity that preserved much pre-Christian theological content within new institutional frameworks. Archaeological evidence from Irish monasteries reveals the integration of traditional craft techniques, artistic motifs, and architectural features with Christian religious functions, while manuscript illumination demonstrates the sophisticated ways Celtic artistic traditions were adapted to serve Christian theological purposes without losing their essential aesthetic and symbolic characteristics. The Scandinavian conversion process involved more dramatic cultural disruption due to the violent conflicts that accompanied missionary efforts and the strong resistance offered by established pagan institutions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gamla Uppsala reveals the systematic destruction of pagan temples and idols during the conversion period, with burned structural remains and deliberately broken religious objects indicating the forcible replacement of traditional religious infrastructure with Christian institutions. However, the same sites also contain evidence of continuity in ritual practices, with Christian churches constructed using traditional building techniques and incorporating decorative elements that preserved essential aspects of earlier religious architecture while adapting to new ceremonial requirements. The transformation of seasonal festivals represents one of the most successful aspects of Christian adaptation of pagan traditions, with major agricultural celebrations being incorporated into the Christian liturgical calendar, while preserving their essential social and economic functions. Christmas absorbed many elements of Germanic Yule celebrations, including the use of evergreen decorations, elaborate feasting and gift-giving practices that maintained traditional midwinter customs while redirecting their theological significance toward Christian nativity themes. Archaeological evidence from medieval settlements reveals the continuity of midwinter celebration patterns with large-scale cooking facilities, evidence of extended feasting activities, and deposits of seasonal offerings that suggest the preservation of essential festival elements despite official religious transformation. Easter's incorporation of spring fertility symbols, including eggs, rabbits, and flowering plants, demonstrates the successful integration of Germanic and Celtic spring festivals with Christian resurrection theology. Archaeological evidence from medieval churches reveals the use of traditional spring symbols in Christian decorative programs, while cemetery excavations show the continuation of spring burial customs and memorial practices that combined Christian theological concepts with traditional beliefs about seasonal renewal and ancestral commemoration. The timing of Easter, according to lunar calculations, preserves the astronomical knowledge that had governed pagan festival calendars while adapting these technical systems to serve Christian liturgical requirements. Harvest festivals underwent similar transformations as communities adapted traditional Thanksgiving ceremonies to Christian frameworks while preserving essential agricultural and social functions. Michaelmas incorporated elements of Celtic Lugnasad and Germanic harvest celebrations, with church blessing of crops, community feasting, and the settlement of agricultural accounts maintaining the economic and social structures that had characterized pagan harvest festivals. Archaeological evidence from medieval agricultural settlements reveals the continuity of harvest celebration patterns, including large-scale food preparation facilities, evidence of community gatherings, and ritual deposits of agricultural products that suggest ongoing supernatural concerns about crop protection and divine favour for future agricultural cycles. The survival of pagan customs in medieval folklore created parallel religious systems that operated alongside official Christian observance, while preserving essential elements of pre-Christian supernatural belief and ritual practice. Fairy traditions across Celtic territories maintained sophisticated theological concepts about otherworld beings, supernatural territories, and the complex relationships between human communities and non-human supernatural entities that required ongoing ritual attention and careful behavioural protocols. Archaeological evidence supporting these folklore traditions appears in the form of ritual deposits at natural features like springs, caves, and ancient trees, where medieval populations continue to leave offerings and conduct ceremonies despite official Christian prohibition of such practices. Germanic folklore preserved extensive knowledge about supernatural beings including elves, dwarfs, and various categories of household spirits, whose continued presence within domestic spaces required ongoing ritual attention and appropriate behavioural responses. Medieval archaeological sites reveal evidence of continued belief in these supernatural entities through the discovery of household shrines, protective amulets, and ritual deposits within domestic buildings that suggest ongoing attempts to maintain proper relationships with invisible supernatural residents. The persistence of these beliefs appears in medieval literature, where folk tales preserve sophisticated understanding of supernatural ecology and the complex protocols required for safe interaction with otherworld beings. Slavic folklore maintained elaborate traditions about supernatural beings including domovoi, rusalki, and various forest spirits, whose continued influence on human affairs required ongoing ritual attention and seasonal ceremonial observances. Archaeological evidence from medieval Slavic territories reveals the continuation of traditional ritual practices, including seasonal offerings at sacred groves, ritual bathing ceremonies, and the maintenance of household shrines dedicated to ancestral spirits and supernatural protectors. The integration of these practices with Christian observance created syncretic religious systems that preserved essential elements of pre-Christian spirituality, while satisfying the requirements of official Christian membership. Baltic folklore preserved perhaps the most extensive and detailed supernatural traditions in medieval Europe, with elaborate mythological systems that maintained sophisticated understanding of divine hierarchies, cosmic processes, and the complex ritual requirements necessary for maintaining proper relationships with supernatural powers. Archaeological evidence from medieval Baltic territories reveals the remarkable persistence of traditional religious practices despite sustained Christian conversion efforts, with sacred groves continuing to receive offerings, eternal flames being maintained at traditional cult sites, and seasonal festivals preserving their essential ceremonial elements while adapting to Christian calendrical frameworks. The preservation of ancient knowledge through medieval manuscripts created sophisticated systems for maintaining pre-Christian intellectual traditions while adapting them to serve Christian educational and theological purposes. Irish monasteries preserved extensive collections of Celtic mythology, law codes, and technical knowledge through manuscript copying projects that maintained traditional oral literature in written form while integrating it with Christian theological frameworks. The Book of Invasions and other medieval Irish texts preserve sophisticated understanding of pre-Christian cosmology, divine genealogies, and historical traditions, while presenting them within Christian chronological and theological contexts that made them acceptable to medieval Christian audiences. Scandinavian manuscript traditions preserved extensive collections of Norse mythology through works like the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, which maintained detailed knowledge of pre-Christian theological systems while presenting them as historical curiosities rather than active religious traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that these manuscript traditions preserved accurate information about earlier religious practices, with archaeological discoveries frequently confirming details about ritual practices, cult sites, and religious artifacts that appear in medieval literary sources. The accuracy of these preserved traditions demonstrates the sophisticated educational systems that had maintained oral religious knowledge across centuries of cultural change, while adapting to new political and religious circumstances. Germanic legal manuscripts preserved extensive collections of customary law that maintained traditional social institutions, property rights, and conflict resolution mechanisms while adapting them to Christian theological frameworks and medieval political structures. Archaeological evidence from medieval Germanic settlements reveals the continuity of traditional social practices including assembly sites, legal procedures, and community organization patterns that preserved essential elements of pre-Christian social institutions while operating within Christian political frameworks. The integration of traditional legal knowledge with Christian moral theology created sophisticated legal systems that maintained cultural continuity while adapting to changed religious and political circumstances. Slavic manuscript traditions preserve traditional agricultural knowledge, seasonal customs, and supernatural beliefs through chronicles and religious texts that maintained practical information about farming techniques, weather prediction, and ritual practices while presenting them within Christian theological contexts. Archaeological evidence from medieval Slavic agricultural settlements reveals the continuation of traditional farming practices, seasonal ceremonial observances, and supernatural beliefs that combined pre-Christian technical knowledge with Christian religious observance to create integrated agricultural systems that maintained both practical effectiveness and religious orthodoxy. The work of antiquarian scholars during the later medieval period created systematic efforts to preserve and study pre-Christian traditions while maintaining appropriate Christian theological perspectives on pagan religious practices. Medieval chroniclers like Adam of Bremen, Saxo Grammaticus, and Gerald of Wales provided detailed ethnographic accounts of pagan religious practices that preserved crucial information about ritual procedures, cult sites, and theological concepts, while presenting them from Christian perspectives that emphasize their historical rather than contemporary significance. Archaeological research has frequently confirmed the accuracy of these medieval accounts, suggesting that their authors possessed access to reliable oral traditions and first-hand observation of persistent pagan practices. The scholarly preservation of astronomical knowledge represented a crucial aspect of medieval efforts to maintain pre-Christian technical expertise while adapting it to serve Christian educational and practical purposes. Medieval monasteries maintained sophisticated astronomical instruments, calendrical calculations, and mathematical knowledge that derived from earlier pagan traditions, while serving Christian liturgical and agricultural requirements. Archaeological evidence from medieval monastic sites reveals the continuity of astronomical observation practices, with specialized buildings for celestial observation, collections of astronomical instruments, and evidence of the mathematical education necessary for maintaining accurate calendrical systems that coordinated Christian religious observance with agricultural cycles and seasonal festivals. The transformation and legacy of European paganism in medieval Europe demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of both Christian and pagan religious traditions, as they negotiated complex processes of cultural change while preserving essential elements of spiritual knowledge and practice. The success of this transformation process created distinctive forms of European Christianity that maintained deep connections to pre-Christian traditions, while developing innovative theological syntheses that served both religious and practical community needs. Archaeological evidence reveals that this process involved sophisticated cultural negotiations rather than simple replacement, with medieval European communities developing creative solutions that preserved essential elements of their ancestral traditions while adapting to new religious and political circumstances. The persistence of pagan elements within medieval European culture created rich traditions of folklore, seasonal celebration, and supernatural belief that continued to influence European spiritual life throughout the medieval period and beyond. These preserved traditions demonstrate the fundamental importance of pre-Christian religious concepts for European cultural identity, while highlighting the sophisticated ways medieval communities adapted their ancestral heritage to serve contemporary needs and circumstances. The legacy of European paganism thus extends far beyond its historical period, creating enduring influences on European culture, spirituality, and identity that continue to shape European civilization to the present day.